Hey guys, tonight we begin an incredible journey through 1,000 years that changed everything. Picture this, a 6-year-old boy sitting on the most powerful throne in the Western world, about to lose an empire that had ruled for over 1,000 years. His name was Romulus Augustulus, and on September 4th, 476 AD, he became the last Roman emperor of the West. But here's the twist that'll keep you up tonight. This wasn't just the end of Rome. This was the moment when everything you think you know about power, civilization, and even your own country's founding principles was about to be rewritten forever. Now, before we dive into this story that's more dramatic than any Netflix series, I'd love it if you could show some love by hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a like, but only if you're genuinely enjoying what we're exploring together. And hey, I'm curious, where are you listening to this right now? Your bedroom? Maybe you're driving home from work. Drop a comment and let me know what time zone you're in. There's something magical about knowing we're all experiencing this journey together, even though we're scattered across the globe. So get comfortable, maybe dim those lights a little, and let's step back in time to witness the most important day you've probably never heard of. September 4th, 476 AD, Rome. Imagine being 6 years old and having the weight of an empire on your shoulders. That was the reality for little Romulus Augustulus, and yes, that was actually his name. His father, Orestes, had basically staged a coup and put his own son on the throne, thinking he could rule through the boy. But here's where it gets interesting and a little heartbreaking. This wasn't the Rome of gladiators and grand conquests that we see in movies. By 476, the Western Roman Empire was like a once magnificent mansion that had been slowly falling apart for decades. The paint was peeling, the roof was leaking, and frankly, most of the good furniture had already been sold off to pay the bills. According to the historian Edward Gibbon in his masterwork, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the empire had been hemorrhaging money, people, and prestige for over a century. The great Roman legions. Most of them were now made up of Germanic warriors who fought for whoever paid them the most. The mighty Roman economy? Well, let's just say that when you can't even mint proper coins anymore, you know you're in trouble. But young Romulus probably didn't understand any of this. Picture him in the imperial palace, likely confused, maybe a little scared, surrounded by adults who are all pretending everything was fine while secretly planning their exit strategies. It's like being the kid whose parents are getting divorced, but everyone keeps telling you everything's normal while they're literally packing boxes in the next room. Then came Odoacer. Now, this is where our story gets really fascinating, because Odoacer wasn't some savage barbarian like Hollywood would have you believe. He was actually a brilliant Germanic chieftain who understood something that the Romans had forgotten. Respect is earned, not inherited. Odoacer had been serving Rome faithfully for years, leading Germanic troops in the Roman army. But when Orestes refused to grant land to Odoacer's soldiers, land they'd been promised for their service, well, that was the final straw. As the ancient historian Procopius recorded in his Wars, Odoacer essentially said, "You know what? We don't need you anymore." And here's the kicker. When Odoacer marched into Ravenna, where the Western court had moved because Rome itself wasn't even safe anymore, he didn't execute little Romulus. Instead, according to the chronicles of Marcellinus Comes, he actually granted the boy a pension and sent him to live quietly in Campania. Think about that for a moment. The man who ended the Roman Empire showed more mercy to its last emperor than Rome had shown to countless conquered peoples over the centuries. But why does this matter to you right now in 2024? Well, here's something that might blow your mind. When the founding fathers were designing America, they were absolutely obsessed with Rome. They studied its rise, its glory, and most importantly, its fall. George Washington himself was compared to Cincinnatus, the Roman who gave up power voluntarily. The architecture of Washington, D.C.? Pure Roman inspiration. Even our Senate takes its name from the Roman Senate. The founders looked at 476 AD and asked themselves, how do we build something that won't collapse like Rome did? They were terrified of creating another empire that would crumble under its own weight. That's why we have separation of powers, term limits, and a constitution that's deliberately hard to change. September 4th, 476. AD wasn't just the end of Rome, it was the ghost that haunted the birth of America. But here's what really keeps historians up at night, and what should fascinate you as you're lying there in the dark. Odoacer didn't think he was ending anything. In his mind, he was just reorganizing management. He still sent respectful letters to the Eastern Emperor in Constantinople. He still used Roman titles and Roman laws. He probably thought he was saving the empire, not destroying it. Isn't that terrifying? The most important ending in Western history happened almost by accident, by a man who thought he was just solving a payroll problem. And you know what the really wild part is? Nobody at the time realized what had just happened. There were no newspaper headlines reading Roman Empire ends, no special broadcasts. Most people in the empire probably didn't even know that their 6-year-old emperor had been quietly retired to the countryside. Life just went on. It was only centuries later that historians looked back and said, oh wait, that was the end of everything. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about this. How many world-changing moments are happening right now that we don't even recognize? How many 6-year-old emperors are sitting on thrones they don't understand, in empires that are already over? The fall of Rome teaches us that sometimes the biggest changes happen not with a bang, but with a whisper. Sometimes empires don't collapse, they just stop. And sometimes the most important day in history is just another Tuesday for the people living through it. But here's where our story gets even more intriguing, because what happened next is where things get really interesting. You see, when Rome fell, it left behind a power vacuum that had to be filled, and the people who stepped into that vacuum weren't who you'd expect. In our next chapter, we're going to meet the so-called barbarian kings, who inherited Rome's ashes, and ask ourselves, were they really the savage destroyers of civilization that history painted them as? Or were they something far more sophisticated and far more relatable to our modern world than we've ever imagined? Now imagine walking into a boardroom where the new CEO used to be a motorcycle gang leader, but he's wearing a 3-piece suit and quoting Shakespeare. That's essentially what happened across Europe in the 5th and 6th centuries, and it's one of the most fascinating transformations in human history. Meet the barbarian kings, and I use that term loosely, because what I'm about to tell you will completely shatter everything you think you know about these so-called savage rulers. Let's start with Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king of Italy. Now, when you hear barbarian king, you probably picture some guy in animal skins, right? Grunting around a campfire, maybe gnawing on a leg of mutton? Well, here's what's going to blow your mind. Theodoric was basically the Steve Jobs of the 6th century. According to the historian Jordanes in his Getica, Theodoric spent his childhood as a hostage in Constantinople. But here's the twist. It wasn't really a hostage situation. It was more like an elite boarding school exchange program. The Byzantine Emperor Leo I essentially said, hey, send us your brightest kid, and we'll give him the best education money can buy. So picture this. Little Theodoric, probably around 8 years old, walking through the marble halls of the great palace of Constantinople. He's learning Greek literature, Roman law, military strategy, and most importantly, how to run an empire. For 10 years he absorbed everything: Byzantine bureaucracy, Roman engineering, Christian theology, classical philosophy. He was like a sponge soaking up 1,000 years of civilization. But here's where it gets really interesting. When Theodoric returned to his people and eventually became king, he didn't throw all that Roman stuff away. Instead, he did something brilliant. He became a cultural bridge. The historian Procopius, in his Wars, describes Theodoric's court in Ravenna, and it reads like something out of a Renaissance palace. Gothic warriors were discussing Virgil. Roman senators were advising on Germanic customs. Theodoric himself would hold court wearing a purple robe, the ultimate symbol of Roman imperial power, while speaking fluent Latin and dispensing justice according to Roman law. And you know what the most mind-blowing part is? He made it work. Under Theodoric, Italy experienced what scholars call a golden age. Trade flourished, cities were rebuilt, and according to the chronicler Cassiodorus, who served in Theodoric's government, crime virtually disappeared. He even learned to read Latin, which was pretty remarkable for a Frankish king. But no matter what he did, he couldn't shake that barbarian label. Pope Leo III, meanwhile, was dealing with his own legitimacy crisis. According to Thomas F.X. Noble in the Republic of St. Peter, the Roman nobility viewed Leo as an upstart. He wasn't from one of the traditional papal families, and they questioned his moral authority. According to Gregory of Tours in his History of the Franks, Clovis was ruthless, cunning, and absolutely brilliant at reading people. Here's a story that'll give you chills. In 496 AD, Clovis was losing a crucial battle against the Alemanni tribe. His army was breaking, his warriors were fleeing, and defeat seemed certain. At that moment, according to Gregory of Tours, Clovis looked up at the sky and said something that changed European history forever. Jesus Christ, if you give me victory today, I'll convert to your faith. Now, whether you believe that's divine intervention or just desperate psychology, what happened next was pure genius. Clovis didn't just convert, he convinced 3,000 of his warriors to convert with him on Christmas Day, 508 AD. But here's the strategic brilliance. By becoming Catholic instead of Arian Christian, like most other Germanic kings, Clovis aligned himself with the Pope and the majority of his Roman subjects. Think about that for a moment. This former barbarian warlord had just executed one of the most sophisticated political maneuvers in medieval history. He understood something that modern politicians still struggle with. Sometimes the best way to gain power is to serve something bigger than yourself. And the results? According to the Liber Historia Francorum, within a generation, the Franks had become the dominant power in Western Europe. Clovis had essentially figured out how to make 500,000 Franks rule over 5 million Gallo-Romans and make everyone happy about it. But let's talk about what really made these barbarian kings successful, because it's a lesson that applies to anyone trying to lead in a complex world today. These weren't conquerors in the traditional sense, they were cultural entrepreneurs. Take the Visigothic king Alaric II, who ruled in Spain and southern France. According to the legal scholar Catherine Fisher-Drew, Alaric created something unprecedented, a legal code that applied both Roman law and Germanic customs, depending on whether you were Roman or Gothic. Imagine that! Instead of imposing one system on everyone, he said, "You know what? Romans can live by Roman law, Goths can live by Gothic law, and we'll figure out the interactions case by case." It was like creating a legal operating system that could run multiple programs simultaneously. And here's what's really fascinating, and I want you to think about this as you're lying there in the dark. These barbarian kings were essentially doing what every successful modern leader has to do. They were managing diversity. They had Germanic warriors who valued personal loyalty and courage. They had Roman aristocrats who valued education and bureaucratic efficiency. They had Christian bishops who valued moral authority. And somehow these savage barbarian kings figured out how to make it all work together. The Burgundian king Gundobad, according to the historian Ian Wood in the Merovingian kingdoms, actually created what might be the first recorded example of religious tolerance in post-Roman Europe. He was Arian Christian, his wife was Catholic, his ministers were a mix of both, and he basically said, "Everyone worship however you want, just don't kill each other over it." Pretty progressive for a supposed barbarian, don't you think? But here's what really gets me, and what should keep you fascinated as you drift off. These kings understood something that we often forget in our modern world. They knew that real strength doesn't come from destroying what came before. It comes from building something new that incorporates the best of everything that existed. Think about Theodoric again. He could have torn down every Roman building, burned every Roman book, and tried to start from scratch. Instead, he preserved Roman architecture while adding Gothic influences. He maintained Roman schools while ensuring Germanic customs were respected. He was like a master chef who takes ingredients from different cuisines and creates something entirely new, but somehow familiar. And you know what's wild? We can actually see their influence everywhere today. The idea of constitutional monarchy, that comes from these barbarian kings who learned to balance Germanic warrior culture with Roman legal traditions. The concept of religious freedom. Thank the Burgundians and Visigoths who figured out how to let different Christian sects coexist. Even the idea of cultural assimilation versus cultural preservation, these guys were wrestling with that 500 years ago. I'm curious, have you ever been in a situation where you had to lead people from completely different backgrounds? Maybe at work, maybe in your community? Drop a comment and tell me how you handled it, because I guarantee you were facing the same challenges as Theodoric and Clovis. But here's the question that's going to haunt your dreams tonight. If these so-called barbarian kings were so sophisticated, so successful at cultural integration, so good at building stable societies, why do we still call them barbarians? The answer might disturb you, because it has everything to do with who gets to write history, and who gets to decide what civilization really means. But there's something even more intriguing than these barbarian kings and their remarkable transformations. Because while they were busy learning how to rule former Roman territories, there was another power rising in Europe, one that would eventually claim authority over kings themselves and reshape the very meaning of power in the medieval world. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic moments in European history, when a pope would do something so audacious, so unprecedented, that it would echo through the centuries and fundamentally change the relationship between earthly power and divine authority. And it all started with a king named Charles, who would become known to history as Charlemagne. Picture this. You're the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. You've just conquered half the continent, and you're kneeling in prayer on Christmas morning in the most sacred church in Christendom. Suddenly, without warning, someone places a crown on your head, and the entire congregation erupts in cheers. The problem? You had absolutely no idea this was going to happen. Welcome to December 25th, 800 AD, the day that changed the balance of power between church and state forever, and possibly the most brilliant political ambush in European history. Charles, who we know as Charlemagne, was already having what you might call a complicated year. According to Einhard's Life of Charlemagne, and Einhard was actually there, serving as Charlemagne's personal secretary and biographer, the king had travelled to Rome not for glory, but to solve a crisis. Pope Leo III was in serious trouble. The previous year he'd been brutally attacked by Roman nobles who accused him of adultery and perjury. They'd actually tried to cut out his tongue and gouge out his eyes, according to the Liber Pontificalis. Leo had barely escaped with his life and fled north to seek Charlemagne's protection. So there's your setup. A pope fighting for his legitimacy, and a king who's essentially become the protector of the Catholic Church. But here's where it gets deliciously complicated, and I want you to imagine the political chess game happening behind the scenes. Charlemagne wasn't just any king. Over the past 30 years, he'd conquered the Lombards in Italy, defeated the Saxons in Germany, pushed the Muslims back across the Pyrenees, and created an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Danube River. According to the Royal Frankish Annals, his kingdom covered what's now France, Germany, northern Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and parts of Spain. Basically, he controlled more of Europe than anyone since the Roman emperors. But here's the thing that's going to keep you thinking tonight. Charlemagne was still, technically, just a barbarian king. Sure, he was incredibly successful, but in the eyes of Byzantine Constantinople, the real heirs to Rome, he was just another Germanic warlord who'd gotten lucky, and that drove Charlemagne absolutely crazy. The scholar Peter Brown, in The Rise of Western Christendom, describes how Charlemagne was obsessed with Roman legitimacy. He collected Roman books, hired Roman scholars, tried to revive Roman architecture. He even learned to read Latin, which was pretty remarkable for a Frankish king. But no matter what he did, he couldn't shake that barbarian label. Pope Leo III, meanwhile, was dealing with his own legitimacy crisis. According to Thomas F. X. Noble in The Republic of St. Peter, the Roman nobility viewed Leo as an upstart. He wasn't from one of the traditional papal families, and they questioned his moral authority. He needed a powerful protector, but he also needed to prove that he could grant legitimacy, not just receive it. So picture Christmas Eve, 799 AD. Charlemagne has just finished a trial where he essentially cleared Leo of all charges, not because he necessarily believed Leo was innocent, but because, as Einhard records, no one has the right to judge the Apostolic See. It was a brilliant legal maneuver that strengthened both the Pope's position and Charlemagne's role as protector of the Church. But Leo had one more card to play. Christmas morning, 800 AD, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. According to the detailed account in the Liber Pontificalis, Charlemagne arrived for Christmas Mass wearing simple Frankish clothes, a tunic, a cloak, and soft leather shoes. Nothing imperial about his appearance. He was just a king attending church. The service proceeded normally. Charlemagne participated in the readings, probably sang some hymns. He was actually known for his deep, resonant voice. And then, at the moment when the gospel reading concluded, something unprecedented happened. Pope Leo III approached Charlemagne, who was kneeling in prayer before the tomb of St. Peter. Without warning, without any announcement, Leo placed a golden crown upon Charlemagne's head and declared him Emperor of the Romans. The congregation, according to Einhard, immediately burst into cheers. To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and pacific Emperor of the Romans, life and victory. But here's the moment that gives me chills every time I think about it. Charlemagne's reaction. Einhard, who knew him personally, writes that Charlemagne was so surprised and apparently so annoyed that he declared he never would have entered the church that day if he had known what the Pope intended to do. Now, was Charlemagne really surprised? That's the million-dollar question that historians are still debating. The scholar Janet Nelson, in King and Emperor, argues that this was probably a carefully orchestrated political theatre. After all, you don't just happen to have an imperial crown lying around, and that chant from the congregation sounded awfully rehearsed. But whether it was planned or spontaneous, the implications were staggering. Think about what had just happened. For the first time in over 300 years, Western Europe had an emperor. But unlike the old Roman emperors who claimed divine right through their own authority, this emperor had been crowned by the Pope. The message was crystal clear. Papal authority could create imperial authority. The church wasn't just a spiritual institution anymore, it was a kingmaker. And this is where it gets really interesting for us modern folks, because this moment essentially created the template for the relationship between religion and political power that still influences us today. Have you ever wondered why American presidents get sworn in with their hand on a Bible? Why British monarchs are crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury? Why politicians still feel the need to talk about their faith? It all goes back to this Christmas morning in 800 AD, but the ramifications went far beyond symbolism. According to the historian Rosamund McKittrick in Charlemagne, the Formation of a European Identity, this coronation fundamentally changed how Europeans thought about authority, legitimacy, and the relationship between earthly and divine power. The Byzantine emperor in Constantinople was absolutely furious. From his perspective, there could only be one Roman emperor, and that was him. Charlemagne's coronation was essentially a declaration that the West no longer recognized Byzantine supremacy. It took years of diplomatic negotiations before Constantinople grudgingly acknowledged Charlemagne's title. But here's what really fascinates me about this story, and what I want you to think about as you're getting comfortable there. This was the moment when medieval Europe truly began to see itself as something distinct from both the classical Roman world and the Byzantine East. Charlemagne didn't just become an emperor that day, he became the first emperor of what we might call Western civilization as a unique cultural and political entity. The scholar Robert Foltz, in The Concept of Empire in Western Europe, argues that this coronation was essentially the birth certificate of the idea of a unified Christian Europe. And you know what's wild? Charlemagne took this responsibility seriously. According to the Capitulary of 802, he immediately began implementing what he called the Carolingian Renaissance, a massive educational and cultural reform program designed to revive learning throughout his empire. He established schools in every monastery and cathedral. He standardized the alphabet. Yes, the letters you're reading right now trace their lineage back to Charlemagne's scribes. He preserved thousands of classical texts that would have otherwise been lost forever. Basically, this barbarian emperor became one of history's greatest champions of education and literacy. But here's the question that should keep you up tonight. Was Pope Leo III a genius who orchestrated one of history's greatest political coups? Or was he a desperate man who accidentally created a monster he couldn't control? Because once you give someone imperial authority in the name of God, it becomes really hard to take it back. The relationship between popes and emperors would become one of the central conflicts of medieval European history, leading to centuries of struggle over who really held ultimate authority, the spiritual or the temporal power. Think about your own life for a moment. Have you ever given someone authority over you, thinking you could control how they used it, only to discover they had their own ideas? That's essentially what happened between the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire for the next 700 years. But as Charlemagne was building his Christian empire and establishing new relationships between church and state, there was another force stirring in the north, one that would challenge everything he'd created. From the fjords of Scandinavia, a people were preparing to burst onto the European scene with a violence and sophistication that would terrify and transform the medieval world. They called themselves the Norse, but history would remember them by another name, and their first major raid was just 8 years away. What if I told you that everything you think you know about Vikings is probably wrong? That the horned helmets never existed, that they were actually obsessive about personal hygiene, and that they might have been history's first global entrepreneurs? Well, settle in, because we're about to shatter some myths and discover why these savage raiders were actually centuries ahead of their time. June 8th, 793 AD. A small monastery on a tiny island off the coast of northern England, The monks of Lindisfarne are going about their morning prayers when suddenly sleek wooden ships appear on the horizon. What happened next would be remembered as the beginning of the Viking Age, but probably not for the reasons you think. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records this moment with genuine terror. In this year, terrible portents appeared over Northumbria and sorely frightened the people. They consisted of immense whirlwinds and flashes of lightning, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. But here's what's fascinating, and what most people don't realise. This wasn't some random act of barbarism. According to the historian Michael McCormick in Origins of the European Economy, the raid on Lindisfarne was actually a precisely calculated business decision. Think about it this way. These Vikings had sailed across the North Sea in open boats, navigated treacherous waters, and landed exactly where they intended to land. That's not luck. That's advanced maritime technology and sophisticated planning. The historian Judith Jesch, in Ships and Men in the Late Viking Age, describes how Viking longships were basically the Formula One cars of medieval Europe. These ships were engineering marvels. According to archaeological evidence from the Skuldelev ships found in Denmark, a typical Viking longship was about 100 feet long, could carry up to 60 warriors, drew only 3 feet of water, and could reach speeds of up to 15 knots. More importantly, they are designed to be carried over land. Imagine that. You could literally pick up your warship and walk it to the next river system. But here's what's going to blow your mind. The Vikings weren't just raiders. They were the Amazon, Google, and Tesla of the medieval world, all rolled into one seafaring package. Let me tell you about a man named Ottar, and his story is going to change how you think about Vikings forever. Around 890 AD, Ottar visited the court of King Alfred the Great in England. But he wasn't there to raid. He was there as a diplomat and merchant. According to the account preserved in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, Ottar described his homeland in northern Norway and his incredible journeys. This guy was basically running a medieval multinational corporation. He had reindeer herds, walrus hunting operations, and trading networks that stretched from Greenland to Constantinople. The Chronicle records that Ottar regularly sailed north beyond the Arctic Circle. Think about that. This was 100 years ago, and he was making routine business trips to the Arctic. But what really gets me is this detail. Ottar told King Alfred that he once sailed for 6 days north and then 2 days south, as far as whale hunters go on a 6-day journey. He was describing a business trip to Svalbard. That's only about 600 miles from the North Pole, in the 9th century. This wasn't a savage barbarian. This was an Arctic explorer, international trader and entrepreneur who could navigate by the stars and make business deals in 6 languages. And Ottar wasn't unique. The archaeologist Søren Zindbæk, in The Small World of the Vikings, has traced Viking trade networks that spanned 4 continents. Viking merchants were trading Greenlandic walrus ivory in Egypt, selling Islamic silver in Iceland, and carrying Chinese silk to Newfoundland. They were running the world's first truly global economy. But let's talk about what made them so effective, because it's a masterclass in innovation and adaptation that modern businesses still study today. First, their technology. The historian Nigel Transome in The Sea Wolves explains that Viking shipbuilding was so advanced that some of their techniques weren't rediscovered until the 20th century. They used a construction method called clinker building that made their ships incredibly flexible. These boats could literally bend with the waves instead of fighting them, and their navigation? Forget GPS, these guys were using crystal technology. Archaeological evidence shows they used calcite crystals as sunstones to navigate even in cloudy weather. According to research published in the journal Nature, these crystals can detect polarized light from the sun, even when it's completely overcast. They were using quantum physics to navigate the North Atlantic. But here's what really sets Vikings apart, and what I think modern leaders can learn from: their organisational structure. The historian Neil Price, in The Viking Way, describes how Viking society was incredibly meritocratic. Yes, there were jarls, nobles, and carls, freemen, and thralls, slaves, but social mobility was much more fluid than in the rest of medieval Europe. A poor farmer's son could become a successful trader, then a ship captain, then a wealthy merchant, then maybe even a king. The sagas are full of stories about people who rose from nothing to become legendary figures. It was like Silicon Valley, but with axes and really cool boats. And speaking of social innovation, let's talk about Viking women, because this is where things get really interesting. The historian Judith Jesch notes that Viking women had rights that wouldn't be seen in the rest of Europe for centuries. They could own property, request divorces, and according to the Gragas law code from Iceland, a woman could even carry weapons and defend her honour in court. There are accounts of female Viking warriors, the shield maidens mentioned in the sagas, and before you roll your eyes thinking this is fantasy, the archaeologist Charlotte Hedenstierna Jonsson discovered the grave of a high-ranking Viking warrior in Sweden that contained weapons, gaming pieces, and 2 horses. DNA analysis revealed that this warrior was a woman. She was buried with all the honours of a military commander. But you know what I find most fascinating about Vikings? They were masters of what we'd now call cultural hacking. They didn't just conquer, they adapted and evolved. When Vikings settled in England, they became Anglo-Scandinavians. When they moved to France, they became Normans. When they reached Iceland, they created the world's first parliament, the Althing, established in 930 AD. According to the historian Jesse Byock in Viking Age Iceland, this was a functioning democracy 300 years before the Magna Carta. And when they got to Russia, well, the very name Russia comes from the word Russ, which likely derives from an Old Norse word meaning rowers. The founding dynasty of Russia was essentially Swedish Vikings who became Slavic princes. They didn't just adapt to local culture, they became it. Think about that for a moment. Have you ever moved to a new city or started a new job and had to adapt to a completely different culture? The Vikings were doing this on a continental scale, and they were brilliant at it. But here's the question that keeps historians up at night. Why did the Viking Age end? If they were so successful, so adaptable, so technologically advanced, what happened? The answer is both simple and profound. They became victims of their own success. As the historian Michael Gelting explains in The Kingdom of Denmark by the 11th century, Scandinavian kingdoms were becoming more centralised, more Christian, and more like the rest of medieval Europe. Kings like Harold Bluetooth and Canute the Great were more interested in building stable kingdoms than launching raids. The last great Viking expedition was probably Harold Hardrada's invasion of England in 1066, and it ended with his death at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. 3 days later, William the Conqueror landed at Hastings. The age of Viking adventure was ending, and the age of Norman consolidation was beginning. But here's what's haunting. The Vikings disappeared right when Europe was entering what historians used to call the Dark Ages, after the fall of the Carolingian Empire. Just when Europe needed innovative, adaptive, entrepreneurial spirits the most, the Vikings had settled down and become, well, normal medieval Europeans. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? What if the Viking spirit of exploration and innovation had continued? What if that culture of meritocracy and technological advancement had become the European norm instead of the exception? I'm curious. In your own life, Have you ever seen a period of innovation and dynamism followed by a period of consolidation and stability? Which do you think is better for human progress? Drop a comment and let me know your thoughts. But here's the thing about the end of the Viking Age. It didn't happen in a vacuum. As Vikings were settling down and becoming conventional medieval rulers, Europe itself was fragmenting in ways that would define the next 500 years. The great Carolingian Empire was splitting apart, central authority was collapsing, and local strongmen were building castles on every hilltop. The stage was being set for a completely new way of organizing society, one based not on the Roman model of centralized authority or the Viking model of adventurous entrepreneurship, but on something entirely different. A system of personal relationships, mutual obligations, and armed horsemen that we've come to know as feudalism. And what's fascinating is that this system emerged not from grand planning or political theory, but from pure necessity. As Europe descended into chaos, people had to figure out new ways to survive, to organize, to protect themselves and their communities. Imagine if your entire world operated like a massive living chess game, where every person was a piece, every relationship was a move, and the rules changed depending on who held the most swords. That's essentially what happened to Europe in the 9th and 10th centuries, and it created a system so complex, so personal, and so effective that it dominated European society for over 500 years. Welcome to feudalism, but forget everything you think you know about it, because the real story is far more fascinating than any textbook ever told you. Let's start with a moment that captures the essence of how this all began. It's 887 AD, and Charles the Fat, the last Carolingian emperor to rule both East and West Francia, has just been deposed by his own nobles. According to the Annals of Fulda, Charles was deemed unfit to rule because he couldn't defend the realm against Viking raids. But here's the kicker. There was no obvious replacement, no clear system of succession, no central authority left to maintain order. The historian Timothy Reuter, in Germany in the early Middle Ages, describes what happened next as the greatest political crisis in medieval European history. Suddenly counts, dukes, bishops, and local strongmen found themselves asking the same question. Now what? And the answer they came up with was brilliant in its simplicity. We'll figure it out as we go. This wasn't some grand political theory cooked up by medieval philosophers. Feudalism emerged organically, relationship by relationship, deal by deal, because people needed to survive. Think of it like a medieval version of a startup ecosystem. Lots of small, independent operators making personal agreements to share resources and reduce risk. But here's where the chess metaphor really comes alive. In chess, every piece has a specific role and can only move in certain ways. A pawn can't suddenly become a queen, and a bishop can't move like a knight. Medieval society worked the same way, but with one crucial difference. The pieces could negotiate with each other. Let me tell you the story of a man named Gerard of Roussillon, because his life perfectly illustrates how this system actually worked. According to the chronicle written by Odo of Cluny, Gerard was born around 820 AD as a relatively minor noble in Burgundy. But through a series of clever alliances and personal relationships, he became one of the most powerful men in 9th century Europe. Here's how Gerard played the game. First, he made himself useful to King Charles the Bald by providing military service during Viking raids. In return, Charles granted him several counties in Burgundy, but Gerard didn't stop there. He formed marriage alliances with other noble families. He patronized monasteries, which made the church his ally, and he carefully cultivated relationships with other powerful counts. By the time Gerard died in 879, according to the historian Constance Bouchard in Those of My Blood, he controlled territories that stretched from the Alps to the Atlantic, commanded the loyalty of dozens of lesser nobles, and had essentially created his own mini-kingdom within the crumbling Carolingian Empire. But here's what's fascinating. Gerard never rebelled against royal authority. He just made himself so indispensable, so well-connected and so powerful that kings had to negotiate with him as an equal. He turned feudalism into an art form. And this brings us to the heart of what made feudalism work. It was fundamentally based on personal relationships and mutual benefit. The historian Mark Bloch, in his classic work Feudal Society, describes how these relationships created what he calls a network of dependence running from top to bottom of the social scale. But let's break down exactly how this network functioned, because it's more sophisticated than most people realize. At the top, you had the king, but unlike Roman emperors or modern presidents, medieval kings didn't rule through bureaucracy. They ruled through relationships. A king would grant a piece of land, called a fief, to a great lord who became his vassal, in exchange for military service and loyalty. But that great lord couldn't possibly manage all his land personally, so he would sub-grant portions of it to lesser lords, who became his vassals. And this process continued all the way down to the local level. According to the medieval legal text known as the Libri Feudorum, a typical vassal owed his lord three main things: military service, usually 40 days per year, financial support, especially for major expenses like ransoming the lord from captivity, and counsel, attending the lord's court and offering advice. But here's what's really clever about this system. It worked both ways. The lord owed protection, justice, and support to his vassals. If a lord failed to uphold his obligations, vassals could legitimately break their oaths and find a new lord. It was like a medieval employment contract with a built-in resignation clause. The historian Susan Reynolds in Fiefs and Vassals points out that this created an incredibly flexible and responsive system of government. Unlike centralized bureaucracies that could become rigid and unresponsive, feudalism adapted naturally to local conditions and individual personalities. But let's talk about what this looked like in everyday life, because that's where feudalism gets really interesting. Picture a typical manor in 10th century France. At the centre, you've got the Lord's Hall, part fortress, part courthouse, part community centre. According to archaeological evidence from sites like Chateau Gaillard, these early manor houses were designed to serve multiple functions: defence, administration, and social interaction. The lord of the manor might hold court 3 times a week, settling disputes between peasants, witnessing marriages, authorising land transfers, and planning defence against raiders. But he was also expected to provide hospitality, protection, and justice to everyone under his authority. According to the Domesday Book, that incredible survey of English landholding commissioned by William the Conqueror in 1086, a typical manor included the lord's domain, his personal land, peasant holdings, common lands for grazing, mills, churches, and sometimes markets. But what's fascinating is how interconnected everything was. The peasants weren't just tenants. They were part of a complex web of mutual obligations. They owed labour service to the lord, typically 3 days a week, but the lord owed them protection, access to common lands, and the right to justice in his court. The miller, the blacksmith, the priest, everyone had specific roles and specific relationships with everyone else. It was like a small, self-contained ecosystem where everyone knew everyone else, and everyone's survival depended on the system working smoothly. But here's where feudalism gets even more interesting. It was incredibly innovative in terms of military technology and tactics. The historian Lynn White Jr., in Medieval Technology and Social Change, argues that feudalism was essentially a response to a military revolution. The development of heavy cavalry. Think about it. A fully armed knight on a warhorse was like a medieval tank. but equipping and training a heavy cavalryman was incredibly expensive, according to calculations by the historian Michael Prestwich in Armies and Warfare in the Middle Ages. Outfitting a single knight cost about as much as equipping 20-foot soldiers. So how do you create and maintain a professional heavy cavalry force without a centralized government that can tax and spend? Simple. You give warriors land in exchange for military service. The income from the land supports the knight, and in return, he shows up ready to fight whenever needed. But feudalism wasn't just about military efficiency, it was also about legal innovation. The historian Paul Brand, in The Making of the Common Law, describes how feudal courts developed sophisticated legal procedures that would eventually evolve into modern legal systems. For example, the concept of due process, the idea that you can't be punished without a fair trial, emerged from feudal legal principles. If a lord wanted to punish a vassal, he had to hold a court, present evidence, and allow the vassal to defend himself before his peers. This wasn't just fairness, it was practical politics, because arbitrary punishment would destroy the trust that held the whole system together. And speaking of innovation, let's talk about something that might surprise you: social mobility. Yes, feudalism had rigid hierarchies, but there was actually more social mobility than you might expect. The historian David Herlihy, in The History of Feudalism, documents numerous cases of peasants who became merchants, merchants who became knights, and knights who rose to become great lords. Take the story of Suger of Saint-Denis, who started life as a peasant's son but became one of the most powerful men in 12th century France. According to his own writings, Suger was sent to school at the monastery of Saint-Denis, where he befriended the future King Louis VII. Through intelligence, hard work, and political skill, Suger eventually became abbot of Saint-Denis and served as regent of France when Louis went on the Second Crusade. From peasant to regent in one lifetime. Try doing that in the Roman Empire. But you know what I find most fascinating about feudalism? It solved problems that we're still struggling with today. How do you balance centralized authority with local autonomy? How do you create accountability between leaders and followers? How do you build trust in a world where formal institutions are weak? Have you ever worked in an organization where the official hierarchy didn't match the real power structure? Where personal relationships mattered more than job titles? That's essentially how all of medieval Europe operated, and in many ways it worked better than you might expect. But feudalism had one major weakness, and it's the same weakness that affects any system based on personal relationships. It only worked as long as people honoured their commitments, and as we'll see, maintaining those commitments required something more than just good intentions. It required visible, permanent symbols of power and protection. It required fortifications that could dominate the landscape and demonstrate a lord's ability to defend his people. It required the rise of a new kind of architecture that would transform the European countryside and create some of the most iconic structures in human history. The age of the castle was about to begin, and with it, a transformation in how medieval people thought about war, peace, power, and the very meaning of home. There's something almost magical about standing in the ruins of a medieval castle, isn't there? Those massive stone walls rising from the landscape, windows that once looked out over kingdoms, chambers where kings made decisions that shaped continents. But what if I told you that these weren't just military fortresses? They were the ultimate status symbols, the medieval equivalent of buying a private island and a space program combined. The story of medieval castles is really the story of the world's first real estate millionaires, and it begins with something surprisingly humble: a pile of dirt. Around 950 AD, in the countryside of northern France, a minor lord named Fulk Nera was facing a problem that would be familiar to any modern entrepreneur. How do you scale up your business when you're competing against bigger, more established players? Fulk controlled the county of Anjou, but he was surrounded by more powerful neighbours. To the north, the Dukes of Normandy. To the east, the Counts of Blois. To the south, the Dukes of Aquitaine. According to the chronicler Adama of Chaban, Fulk was a man of small stature but great ambition, who understood that in a world of giants you must build yourself taller, and build he did. Over the course of his 51-year reign, Fulk Nerra constructed more than 13 castles throughout Anjou. But here's what's fascinating, and what changed European warfare forever. Fulk didn't just build fortresses. He created what the historian Richard Allen Brown calls a revolutionary system of territorial control. Each of Fulk's castles was positioned exactly one day's march from the next. This meant that his army could move across his entire territory while always having a secure base of operations. More importantly, it meant that any enemy force trying to invade Anjou would constantly be under threat from castle garrisons that could sally out and attack their flanks. But let's talk about what these early castles actually looked like, because they were nothing like the massive stone fortresses you see in movies. According to archaeological evidence from sites like Chateau de Mayenne, Fulk's castles started as motte and bailey constructions, essentially a big artificial hill, the motte, with a wooden tower on top surrounded by a courtyard, the bailey, enclosed by wooden walls. The historian Robert Lydiard, in Castles and Context, describes how these early castles could be built incredibly quickly. A motte and bailey castle could be constructed in as little as 6 weeks, using local labour and materials. But here's the clever part. They were designed to be upgraded. Think of it like buying a starter home with the intention of renovating. Fulk would build a wooden castle to establish control of an area, then gradually replace the wooden structures with stone as his wealth and power grew. It was a brilliant example of scalable architecture. But the real revolution came with the next generation of castle builders, and this is where the economics get absolutely mind-blowing. Let me tell you about William Marshall, who the historian David Crouch calls the greatest knight who ever lived. William started his career as a landless younger son, but through tournaments, military service, and sheer political brilliance, he eventually became one of the richest men in medieval Europe. According to the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, written by an anonymous chronicler who actually knew William personally, by 1189 William Marshall owned castles in England, Wales, Normandy and Ireland. But here's what's staggering. The cost of just one of his major stone castles was equivalent to about $500 million in today's money. How do we know this? Well, we have actual medieval accounts, and they're incredibly detailed. The historian R. Allen Brown, in The Architecture of Castles, analyses the building accounts for Chateau Gaillard, built by Richard the Lionheart between 1196 and 1198. The total cost was $11,500, which doesn't sound like much until you realise that this represented more than twice the annual revenue of the entire Kingdom of England. To put that in perspective, it would be like Jeff Bezos spending his entire net worth to build a single building, and Richard built Chateau Gaillard in just 2 years. The logistics alone were staggering. According to the Pipe Rolls, England's financial records, Richard employed over 6,000 workers, brought stone from quarries 50 miles away, and used more iron than was typically produced in England in an entire decade. But why were people willing to spend such incredible sums on castles? The answer lies in understanding what castles actually did, and this is where things get psychologically fascinating. A castle wasn't just a military installation, it was a psychological weapon. The historian Matthew Johnson, in Behind the Castle Gate, describes how castles were designed to project what he calls seigneurial authority. Essentially, they were massive three-dimensional advertisements that said, "I am rich, powerful, and dangerous. Don't mess with me." Let me give you a specific example. Caerphilly Castle in Wales, built by Gilbert de Clare around 1270, covers 30 acres and includes multiple layers of walls, artificial lakes and towers that rise over 100 feet high. According to the architectural historian Arnold Taylor, Caerphilly was designed not just to be impregnable, but to look impregnable from every angle. A medieval peasant approaching Caerphilly would see this massive stone complex rising from the landscape like something from another world. The message was clear. The person who lives here has resources you can't even imagine. He can afford to move mountains, redirect rivers, and employ hundreds of craftsmen for years at a time. Maybe you should think twice about rebelling against his authority. And this psychological warfare worked both ways. The historian Philippe Contamine, in War in the Middle Ages, notes that just the sight of a well-built castle could cause attacking armies to withdraw without fighting. Why risk a siege that might last months or years when you could find easier targets elsewhere? But here's what's really interesting about castle building. It created what economists would now call a technological arms race. As attacking techniques improved, castle defences had to evolve to match them. The round towers you see on later medieval castles, for example, weren't just aesthetic choices. According to military engineering analyses by the historian Christopher Gravitt, round towers were much harder to undermine than square ones. Attacking engineers couldn't easily dig under corners that didn't exist. Similarly, the development of concentric castle designs, castles within castles, was a direct response to improved siege techniques. If attackers managed to breach the outer walls, they'd find themselves trapped in a killing ground between the outer and inner fortifications, under fire from multiple directions. But you know what I find most fascinating about medieval castle builders? They were incredibly innovative problem solvers who had to think about everything from water supply to waste management. Take Harlech Castle in Wales, built by Edward III's master engineer James of St George. According to building accounts preserved in the National Archives, James designed an ingenious water gate that allowed the castle to be supplied by sea even during a land siege. The castle's walls incorporated sophisticated drainage systems, and the Great Hall included early examples of what we'd now call central heating. James of St George, by the way, was basically the Frank Lloyd Wright of medieval military architecture. He designed castles across Wales that were so advanced that some of his techniques weren't rediscovered until the 19th century. Edward VI paid him what would now be equivalent to millions of dollars annually, making him one of the highest paid architects in history. But castle building wasn't just about military engineering. It was also about creating lifestyle spaces that would attract and impress the medieval elite. The historian Oliver Creighton, in Castles and Landscapes, describes how later medieval castles included elaborate private chambers, gardens, chapels, libraries, and even early forms of plumbing. Conway Castle, another of Edward Thearn's fortifications, included private apartments for the king that featured glazed windows, incredibly expensive in the 13th century, painted walls, and what the building accounts describe as chambers of ease. Essentially, luxury bathrooms with running water. Think about that for a moment. In an age when most people lived in one-room houses with dirt floors, castle builders were creating spaces with indoor plumbing, central heating, and panoramic views. They were luxury resorts with the added benefit of being able to withstand a siege. And speaking of luxury, let's talk about the social aspects of castle life, because this is where medieval castle builders really showed their sophistication. A great castle wasn't just a fortress. It was a political and cultural centre that had to accommodate dozens or even hundreds of people with different social ranks, different needs, and different expectations. The Great Hall was the heart of castle social life. But according to architectural studies by the historian Maurice Keane, These halls were incredibly complex spaces that had to function as dining rooms, courtrooms, reception areas, and entertainment venues all at the same time. The layout of a great hall was a carefully choreographed statement about power and status. The Lord's high table was literally elevated above everyone else's. The arrangement of other tables, the quality of tableware, even the types of food served all communicated precise messages about social hierarchy and political relationships. But here's what really gets me about castle builders. They understood that true power came not just from military strength, but from creating communities that people actually wanted to be part of. Have you ever been to a place, maybe a beautiful hotel or an impressive office building, or even just someone's really well-designed home, and thought, wow, I'd love to live here? Medieval castle builders were masters at creating that feeling. They understood that if you could make your castle the most comfortable, most impressive, most culturally vibrant place in the region, powerful people would want to visit, stay, and eventually ally with you. And this brings us to a crucial point about medieval castle builders that most people miss. They weren't just military engineers or political leaders. They were cultural entrepreneurs who understood that in a fragmented world, local centres of excellence could become incredibly influential. But there's something else about castle building that's going to surprise you, and it connects to a global movement that was about to transform not just Europe, but the entire medieval world. You see, all of this castle building expertise, all of these advances in military engineering and siegecraft, all of this accumulated wealth and organizational capability, it was about to be channeled towards something unprecedented in European history. The Pope was about to call upon the warrior elites of Europe to embark on a military expedition that would span continents, last for centuries, and fundamentally reshape the relationship between Christianity and Islam. The age of the Crusades was beginning, and the same castle-building families who had been fighting each other for control of European territories were about to unite behind a common cause that would take them to the Holy Land. What if everything you've ever seen about the Crusades in movies and TV shows is not just wrong, but spectacularly, almost comically wrong? What if the real story is so much more complex, so much more human, and so much more tragic than anything Hollywood has ever dared to show you? Well, prepare to have your mind completely rewired, because we're about to dive into one of history's most misunderstood chapters. November 27th, 1095, the town of Clermont in central France. Pope Urban II stands before a crowd of nobles, knights, and common people, and delivers what might be the most consequential speech in medieval history. But here's the thing that's going to surprise you. We have absolutely no idea what he actually said. That's right. The speech that launched 1,000 ships and started 200 years of warfare between Christianity and Islam. We don't have a single contemporary transcript. According to the historian Jonathan Riley Smith in The First Crusade and the Idea of Crusading, we have 5 different accounts of Urban's speech, written years later, and they all say completely different things. Some chroniclers claimed Urban talked about rescuing Jerusalem from Muslim occupation. Others said he focused on helping the Byzantine emperor against Turkish expansion. Still others recorded him promising immediate salvation to anyone who took up the cross. But here's what's fascinating, and this is going to change how you think about the entire crusading movement. The speech that actually mattered wasn't Urban's carefully planned address to the nobles. According to the Chronicle of Robert the Monk, after Urban finished his official speech, a French knight named Peter the Hermit stood up in the crowd and began preaching with such passion that people started tearing strips from their clothes to make crosses. Peter wasn't a trained theologian or a political leader. He was basically a charismatic street preacher who somehow ignited a religious frenzy that spread across Europe like wildfire. And this brings us to our first major myth-busting moment. The Crusades weren't a top-down military campaign planned by sophisticated political leaders. They were a grassroots religious movement that quickly spiraled beyond anyone's control. Peter the Hermit's version of the Crusade, what historians call the People's Crusade, was a disaster of almost unimaginable proportions. According to the chronicler Albert of Aachen, Peter gathered somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 followers, men, women, children, elderly people, many of them with no military training whatsoever. They set off for Jerusalem in 1096, but they never even made it out of Europe. Along the way, they massacred Jewish communities in the Rhineland, fought with Hungarian and Bulgarian armies, and finally were completely destroyed by the Turks in Anatolia. The historian Jonathan Phillips, in Holy Warriors, estimates that 95% of Peter's followers died before they ever saw the Holy Land. But here's what's really tragic about this story. Most of these people genuinely believed they were doing God's work. They weren't motivated by greed or political ambition. They were ordinary medieval Christians who had been told that Jerusalem, the holiest city in their faith, was under attack and needed their help. This brings us to one of the most important things to understand about the Crusades. They made sense to medieval people in ways that are almost impossible for us to comprehend today. The historian Karl Erdmann, in The Origin of the Idea of Crusade, explains that medieval Christians lived in a world where the spiritual and physical realms were completely interconnected. If you were a 12th century knight, you didn't just believe in heaven and hell as abstract concepts. You believed they were real places that could be reached through real actions in the real world. When Pope Urban promised that dying in battle for Jerusalem would guarantee immediate entry into paradise, he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was offering what medieval people understood as a literal, legally binding contract with God. And this is where the Muslim perspective becomes crucial, because they were dealing with something they had never encountered before. According to the historian Karel Hillenbrand in the Crusades' Islamic Perspectives, Muslim leaders initially had no idea what to make of these Christian armies. The Islamic world was used to fighting other Muslim states, or dealing with Byzantine military campaigns that had clear political objectives. But the Crusaders seemed to be motivated by something completely different, a religious fervour that made them willing to march thousands of miles and die for a city that most of them had never seen. The Muslim chronicler Ibn al-Athir, writing in the 13th century, described his confusion at Christian behaviour. We had heard of their love for fighting, but we did not know they would abandon their homes and families to die in foreign lands for the sake of a city that brings them no earthly benefit. But here's where the story gets really complex, and where Hollywood always gets it wrong. The Crusades weren't really a Christian versus Muslim conflict. They were a series of overlapping political, religious and economic conflicts that involved Christians fighting Christians, Muslims fighting Muslims, and temporary alliances between Christian and Muslim rulers against common enemies. Let me give you a specific example that illustrates how complicated this really was. During the Second Crusade in 1147, the Christian army was guided through Anatolia by Muslim allies of the Byzantine Emperor, while being attacked by Christian Norman forces from southern Italy, who were technically on the same side but had their own political agenda. Meanwhile, the main Crusader target, Damascus, was ruled by a Muslim emir who had previously been allied with the Crusader Kingdom of Jerusalem against other Muslim states. When the Crusaders attacked Damascus, they were essentially attacking their own former ally, which explains why the siege was such a complete failure. The historian Thomas Asbridge, in The Crusades, the Authoritative History, describes this as a web of shifting alliances where religion was just one factor among many, and often not the most important one. And this brings us to another major myth that needs debunking: the idea that Crusaders were motivated primarily by greed and the desire for wealth. While some crusaders certainly did profit from their expeditions, the historical evidence suggests that most of them actually lost money. The historian Jonathan Riley Smith, in What Were the Crusades?, has analysed hundreds of crusader wills and financial records from the 12th century. What he found is startling. Most crusaders had to sell land, borrow money, or mortgage their estates just to afford the journey to the Holy Land. The average cost of participating in a crusade was equivalent to about 4 times a knight's annual income. In other words, going on crusade was like spending your entire salary for 4 years on a military expedition to a foreign country where you might very well die. The economic incentive argument just doesn't hold up. So why did people do it? The answer seems to be a complex mixture of religious devotion, social pressure, family tradition, and genuine belief in the spiritual benefits of pilgrimage. The historian Marcus Bull, in Knightly Piety and the Lay Response to the First Crusade, describes how many crusaders viewed their expedition as an extension of traditional pilgrimage, a dangerous but spiritually beneficial journey that would bring them closer to God. But let's talk about what actually happened when these crusading armies reached the Holy Land, because this is where the human cost of religious conflict becomes devastatingly clear. July 15th, 1099. After a siege lasting over a month, Crusader forces breached the walls of Jerusalem. What happened next is documented by multiple sources, both Christian and Muslim, and it's one of the darkest chapters in medieval history. According to the Crusader chronicler Raymond of Aguilers, the Christian soldiers killed all the Saracens and Turks they found, whether male or female. The Muslim historian Ibn al-Athir recorded that the population of the Holy City was put to the sword, and the Franks spent a week killing Muslims. Modern historians estimate that somewhere between 10,000 and 70,000 people died in Jerusalem during those July days. Muslims, Jews, and even some Eastern Christians who were mistaken for Muslims by the attacking Crusaders. But here's what's important to understand. This massacre horrified many people at the time, including some Christians. The Syrian chronicler Matthew of Edessa, who was a Christian, wrote that the Franks committed great slaughter, sparing neither age nor sex, and covering the holy places with blood and corpses. This wasn't considered normal medieval warfare. It was recognized as an atrocity even by 12th century standards, and it had consequences that would echo through the centuries. The fall of Jerusalem created what the historian Stephen Runciman called a wound in the relationship between Christianity and Islam that never fully healed. But it also created something unprecedented. 4 Crusader states in the Middle East that would survive for nearly 200 years. And this is where the story becomes really interesting from a cultural perspective, because these Crusader states became laboratories for cross-cultural exchange. The historian Benjamin Kadar, in Crusader Society in the Latin East, describes how Crusader nobles who stayed in the Holy Land gradually adopted Middle Eastern customs, married into local Christian families, and developed trading relationships with Muslim neighbours. Within a generation you had Crusader lords who spoke Arabic, ate Middle Eastern food, dressed in local styles, and conducted most of their business with Muslim merchants. Some of them were more comfortable in Damascus than they would have been in Paris. But this cultural adaptation created its own problems. When new waves of Crusaders arrived from Europe, they were often appalled by how Eastern their fellow Christians had become. According to the chronicler William of Tyre, newly arrived Crusaders accused the established settlers of going soft, losing their Christian identity, and consorting with the enemy. This tension between adaptation and purity would plague the Crusader states throughout their existence, and it's a tension that might sound familiar to anyone who's ever lived abroad and had to navigate between their original culture and their adopted one. Have you ever found yourself caught between 2 different cultural worlds? Maybe you moved to a new country, or even just a different region, and had to figure out how much to adapt versus how much to preserve of your original identity. The Crusader states were dealing with this dilemma on a massive scale, with religious and political survival hanging in the balance. But the most fascinating aspect of the Crusader states might be how they influence both Eastern and Western societies. The historian Joshua Prower in the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem argues that the Crusades introduced Europeans to new technologies, foods, architectural styles, and philosophical ideas that fundamentally changed medieval European culture. Sugar, cotton, new mathematical concepts, advanced medical techniques, soap, spices, new types of fortification design. All of these reached Western Europe through contact with the Islamic world during the crusading period. In some ways, the Crusades accidentally became one of the most important cultural exchange programs in history. But from the Muslim perspective, the Crusades also catalyzed important changes. The historian Paul Cobb in The Race for Paradise describes how the Crusader presence in the Middle East eventually led to greater Muslim unity and the rise of leaders like Saladin, who managed to unite Muslim Syria and Egypt under single rule for the first time in decades. When Saladin recaptured Jerusalem in 1187, he deliberately chose not to massacre the Christian population. According to the chronicler Imad al-Din, Saladin announced that "We shall not follow the example of the Franks, who killed everyone when they took this city." It was a conscious rejection of the Crusader model of conquest. This brings us to the ultimate irony of the Crusades. They probably did more to strengthen Islamic unity and identity than any other single factor in the medieval period. The historian Carol Hillenbrand notes that before the Crusades, the concept of unified jihad against Christian aggression was largely theoretical. The Crusader invasion made it a practical necessity, and yet despite all the warfare, despite all the religious rhetoric, despite all the bloodshed, the most lasting legacy of the Crusades might be the proof they provided that different cultures could coexist, trade, learn from each other, and even develop mutual respect, when political and religious leaders allowed it to happen. But the Crusades were just one part of a much larger transformation happening across Europe during the 11th and 12th centuries. While knights were fighting in the Holy Land, back home something even more revolutionary was taking place. Cities were growing, trade was expanding, and a new class of people was emerging. People who would challenge the entire feudal system and create the foundations of the modern economy. The age of the medieval merchant was about to begin, and with it, Europe would discover that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword or a castle. It's a good business plan and the ability to move money across continents. Here's something that's going to completely change how you think about innovation and entrepreneurship. The world's first tech boom didn't happen in Silicon Valley in the 1990s. It happened in medieval Europe in the 1100s, and it was driven by a group of people who figured out how to turn mud-covered market towns into global economic powerhouses using nothing but ambition, ingenuity, and an almost magical understanding of human psychology. Welcome to the medieval urban revolution, where merchants became millionaires, cities became kingdoms, and a handful of visionary entrepreneurs created the blueprint for the modern global economy. Let's start in a place that, around the year 1000, was literally a swamp. The lagoon of Venice was home to maybe 50,000 people living in scattered fishing villages, making their living from salt production and catching whatever fish they could find in the shallow waters. But by 1200, according to the historian Frederick Lane in Venice, a Maritime Republic, this same marshy archipelago had become the richest city in Europe, with a population of over 100,000 and trading networks that stretched from London to Constantinople to the spice markets of India. How did they do it? The answer is going to sound familiar to anyone who's ever studied modern startup culture. They identified a market gap. developed innovative solutions, and then scaled like crazy. Here's the story that changed everything. In 828 AD, according to the Chronicle of John the Deacon, two Venetian merchants named Buono da Malamocco and Rustico da Torcello were trading in Alexandria, Egypt, when they learned that the local Muslim authorities were planning to confiscate Christian relics from local churches. Now, most people would have seen this as a religious tragedy, but these Venetian merchants saw it as a business opportunity. They convinced the Christian custodians of St. Mark's Cathedral in Alexandria to let them smuggle the saint's remains back to Venice, hidden, according to legend, under layers of pork in their cargo hold to prevent Muslim customs officials from searching too carefully. When they arrived back in Venice with the relics of St. Mark, they had essentially transformed their city from a minor Byzantine outpost into a major pilgrimage destination overnight. According to the historian Thomas Madden in Venice: A New History, within decades, pilgrims from across Europe were travelling to Venice to venerate St. Mark's remains, bringing money, connections, and business opportunities with them. But here's the brilliant part. The Venetians didn't just capitalise on the pilgrimage trade, they used it as a foundation to build something much bigger. They positioned Venice as the natural stopping point for anyone travelling between Europe and the Byzantine Empire, and then between Europe and the Islamic world. The historian Donald Nicole in Byzantium and Venice describes how Venetian merchants developed what we'd now call a freemium business model. They offered free or low-cost transportation to pilgrims and crusaders, but made their real money from the luxury goods they traded along the same routes. And the luxury goods trade was absolutely mind-blowing in its scale and sophistication. According to commercial records preserved in the Venetian state archives, a single galley sailing from Venice to Constantinople in the 13th century might carry Flemish cloth, German silver, English wool, French wine, and Italian silk on the outward journey, then return with Byzantine silk, Bulgarian grain, Black Sea caviar, and spices from as far away as Indonesia. But Venice was just one part of a much larger transformation happening across Europe. Let me tell you about another city that went from zero to global superpower in record time: Florence. Around 1100, Florence was a middling town in Tuscany with maybe 5,000 inhabitants. But by 1300, according to the historian John Najimi in A History of Florence, it had grown to over 100,000 people and had become the banking capital of Europe. Florentine banks had branches in every major European city, and Florentine gold florins were accepted as currency from London to Cairo. How did Florence do it? They invented modern banking, literally. The historian Richard Goldthwaite in The Economy of Renaissance Florence explains how Florentine merchants developed techniques that we still use today: double-entry bookkeeping, letters of credit, international exchange rates, and even early forms of insurance. But what made them truly revolutionary was their understanding of trust and reputation as economic assets. Take the Medici Bank, founded by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici in 1397. According to the business historian Raymond de Ruva in The Rise and Decline of the Medici Bank, Giovanni understood something that modern venture capitalists would recognize immediately. The key to successful banking isn't just lending money. It's building networks of reliable partners who trust you with their most important financial decisions. Giovanni established Medici branches not just in Italian cities, but in Bruges, London, Geneva, and Constantinople. But here's the clever part. Each branch was run as a semi-independent partnership with local merchants who had skin in the game. This meant that Medici bankers in London understood local English business customs, while Medici bankers in Constantinople understood Byzantine commercial law. The result was a financial network that could move money across Europe faster and more reliably, than any government or royal treasury. When the English king needed to borrow money for a war, he went to the Medici. When the Pope needed to transfer funds from England to Rome, he used Medici banks. When merchants in Bruges wanted to buy spices from Alexandria, they arranged credit through Medici branches. But here's what's really fascinating about these medieval merchant cities. They didn't just create new business models, they created entirely new forms of government that prioritized economic growth over traditional aristocratic privilege. Let me tell you about the Hanseatic League, because it's basically the medieval equivalent of a trade federation with its own army. According to the historian Philippe Dollinger in the German Hansa, the Hanseatic League started around 1200 as a loose alliance of German merchant cities, but by 1400 it included over 200 cities and controlled trade throughout the Baltic and North Sea regions. The League operated its own diplomatic corps, maintained its own military forces, and even fought wars against kingdoms that threatened its commercial interests. In 1361-1370, the Hanseatic League actually went to war with the Kingdom of Denmark and won, forcing the Danish king to grant them exclusive trading privileges and the right to approve his successors. Think about that for a moment. A coalition of merchant cities became so powerful that they could dictate terms to kings. It was like if Amazon, Google, and Apple formed an alliance and started negotiating with the US government as equals. But what made these medieval cities so innovative wasn't just their business models. It was their approach to human capital and social mobility. According to the historian David Nicholas in The Growth of the Medieval City, medieval commercial cities were essentially meritocracies where talent and hard work mattered more than birth or family connections. Take the story of Jacques Coeur, which the historian Michel Mollard tells in Jacques Coeur, Merchant Prince of the Middle Ages. Jacques was born around 1395 as the son of a furrier in the French city of Bourges. But through shrewd trading, innovative financing, and what we'd now call supply chain optimization, he became one of the richest men in Europe and the financial advisor to the King of France. Jacques built a commercial empire that stretched from France to Syria, operated silver mines in Central Europe, and even maintained his own private fleet of ships for Mediterranean trade. By 1450, according to surviving account books, Jacques Coeur's annual income was larger than that of most European dukes. But here's what's remarkable about Jacques' story. He wasn't unusual. Medieval commercial cities were full of people who rose from humble origins to incredible wealth and influence through business innovation. It was like a medieval version of the American dream, but without the geographic limitations. And this brings us to something that might surprise you. Medieval cities were hotbeds of technological innovation that rivaled or exceeded anything happening in universities or royal courts. Take water-powered machinery, for example. According to the historian Lynn White Jr., in medieval technology and social change, the proliferation of water mills in medieval cities led to innovations in metallurgy, textile production, and even paper manufacturing that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. The city of Augsburg in southern Germany developed such sophisticated metalworking techniques that Augsburg armour was considered the finest in Europe. The historian Blair Walker, in Manufacturing in Medieval Augsburg, describes workshops that employed hundreds of craftsmen using techniques that remained trade secrets for centuries. Or consider the development of mechanical clocks. According to the horologist Lynn Thorndike in The Mechanical Clock in Medieval Chronometry, the first reliable mechanical clocks were developed not in monasteries or royal courts, but in commercial cities where merchants needed precise timekeeping for coordinating business activities. The clock tower in the Italian city of Milan, completed in 1335, wasn't just a timepiece. It was a symbol of civic pride and commercial sophistication that announced to the world that Milan was a city where time was money and precision mattered. But you know what I find most impressive about these medieval merchant cities? They figured out how to create what we'd now call innovation ecosystems, environments where different kinds of expertise could cross-pollinate and create new solutions to complex problems. Take the city of Córdoba in Islamic Spain during the 10th and 11th centuries. According to the historian Maria Rosa Menocal in The Ornament of the World, Córdoba was home to Muslim merchants, Jewish scholars, Christian craftsmen, and traders from across the Mediterranean world. This diversity created an environment where mathematical innovations from India, engineering techniques from Byzantium, and agricultural methods from North Africa could combine in ways that wouldn't have been possible in more homogeneous societies. The result was a city that, according to contemporary accounts, had over 700 mosques, 300 public baths, 70 libraries, and the most advanced street lighting system in Europe. Córdoba's main library reportedly contained over 400,000 books, more than the rest of Europe combined. Similarly, the city of Toledo became famous throughout medieval Europe as a centre for translation and cultural exchange. According to the historian Charles Burnett in The Introduction of Arabic Learning into England, Toledo's translation schools produced Latin versions of Arabic texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy that revolutionized European scholarship. But here's what really gets me about these medieval cities. They understood something that modern urban planners are still trying to figure out: how to create spaces that are simultaneously economically productive, culturally vibrant, and socially inclusive. Have you ever been in a city that just felt alive, where there was energy in the streets, where you felt like anything was possible, where different kinds of people were mixing and creating new ideas? Medieval cities like Venice, Florence, and Córdoba were designed to create exactly that feeling. The historian Spiro Kostov in The City Shaped describes how medieval city planners deliberately created public spaces, market squares, cathedral plazas, guild halls, that encouraged interaction between different social groups. These weren't just functional spaces. They were stages for civic life where merchants, craftsmen, clergy, and visitors could see and be seen. And this brings us to something that's going to sound very familiar to anyone who's lived through the modern tech boom. The medieval urban revolution created enormous wealth, but it also created enormous social tension. As cities grew richer and more powerful, they increasingly came into conflict with the traditional feudal aristocracy, who saw urban merchants as upstarts threatening the established social order. Kings and nobles who had once dismissed city dwellers as mere traders suddenly found themselves dependent on urban wealth for everything from military financing to luxury goods. The relationship between medieval cities and traditional authority was complicated, contentious, and occasionally explosive, and it was about to be tested by one of the most devastating catastrophes in human history, a plague that would kill 1/3 of Europe's population and reshape the entire social and economic structure of medieval civilization. But here's the remarkable thing. While the plague would destroy much of medieval Europe, the cities and the commercial networks they had created would prove to be the key to recovery and renewal. The urban innovations we've been exploring, the banking systems, the trade networks, the technological expertise, the social mobility, would become the foundation for Europe's emergence from the darkness of the 14th century. Sometimes the most important moments in history begin with something almost impossibly small. In 1347, that something was a bacterium called Yersinia pestis, carried by fleas on the backs of rats aboard merchant ships. Within 4 years, this microscopic organism would accomplish what no army, no king, and no empire had ever managed. It would kill 1 out of every 3 people in Europe and fundamentally reshape the entire structure of medieval civilization. But here's what's going to surprise you about the Black Death. It wasn't just a story of devastation and despair. it was also a story of human resilience, social revolution, and the birth of ideas that would eventually lead to the modern world. And it all started on a beautiful October morning in the bustling port city of Messina, Sicily. October 1347. 12 galleys from the Black Sea port of Kaffa limped into Messina harbour after a harrowing journey across the Mediterranean. According to the chronicle of Michael of Piazza, who witnessed their arrival, the sailors brought in their bones a disease so violent that whoever spoke a word to them was infected and could not escape death. But here's what's haunting about Michael's account. He describes how the Sicilian authorities, recognizing the danger, immediately ordered the ships to leave the harbour. But it was already too late. The disease had come ashore with the first rats to scurry down the mooring ropes, and within days, according to Michael, the whole city was infected. The speed of what happened next defies belief. According to the chronicler Gabriele de Mussi, who compiled eyewitness accounts from across Europe, the plague spread from Messina to mainland Italy within weeks, reached France by spring of 1348, crossed the English Channel by summer, and had penetrated deep into Germany, Poland, and Scandinavia by winter. But let's pause for a moment and think about what this really means. In an age when the fastest communication was a horse and rider, when most people never travelled more than 10 miles from their birthplace, a disease managed to spread across an entire continent in less than 2 years. The medieval world was far more connected than most people realise. The historian David Herlihy, in The Black Death and the Transformation of the West, describes how the plague followed the same trade routes that had made cities like Venice and Florence so prosperous. The very networks that had created medieval Europe's economic miracle now became highways for catastrophe, and the numbers are staggering. According to parish records analysed by the demographer Josiah Russell, England's population dropped from about 4 million to 2.5 million between 1348 and 1351. In France, tax records suggest the population fell from 17 million to 10 million. In some regions of Germany, according to local chronicles, entire towns simply ceased to exist. But here's what's really going to give you chills. We have detailed first-hand accounts of what it was like to live through this apocalypse, and they read like something out of a horror movie. Take the testimony of Agnolo di Tura, a chronicler from Siena who wrote, "Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through breath and sight, and so they died. None could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. Members of a household brought their dead to a ditch as best they could, without priest, without divine offices." Agnolo's account becomes even more heartbreaking when he adds, "I buried my 5 children with my own hands." Think about that for a moment. This man watched his entire family die, then dug their graves himself because there was literally no one else left to do it. But what's remarkable about many of these chronicles is that they also capture moments of extraordinary human courage and compassion. The historian Rosemary Horrocks in The Black Death has collected accounts of physicians who continued treating patients even after watching their colleagues die, of clergy who continued administering last rites, knowing they were likely signing their own death sentences, of ordinary people who risked infection to care for orphan children or elderly neighbours. Take the story of Guillaume de Machaut, the French poet and musician, who survived the plague in Reims, and wrote about a physician named Master Jean who never abandoned his patients, though he saw death claiming all around him. According to Guillaume, Master Jean developed what might have been one of the first systematic approaches to plague treatment, using a combination of dietary restrictions, herbal remedies, and what we'd now call quarantine procedures. Did his methods work? Probably not against the plague itself, but Guillaume notes that Master Jean survived the outbreak, as did many of his patients. Sometimes the historian Samuel Cohn argues in The Black Death Transformed, the simple act of having someone care for you, someone who believed treatment was possible, might have made the difference between life and death. But here's where the story of the Black Death becomes really complex, and where it starts to sound surprisingly relevant to our modern world. The plague didn't affect everyone equally. According to mortality records analysed by the historian John Hatcher in Plague, Population and the English Economy, the disease hit hardest in crowded urban areas and among the poor, while wealthy families who could retreat to isolated country estates had much better survival rates. Sound familiar? The parallels with modern pandemics are striking, and they go beyond just mortality patterns. According to the chronicler Giovanni Boccaccio, writing in Florence during the height of the plague, social divisions actually became more pronounced during the crisis. In his famous Decameron, Boccaccio describes how the rich fled to their country houses, the poor remained in the city to die. But Boccaccio also noted something else that sounds remarkably modern: the breakdown of normal social behaviour during the crisis. He writes about people who became obsessively cautious, avoiding all human contact, and others who became recklessly hedonistic, convinced that death was inevitable, so they might as well enjoy their final days. Have you lived through a major crisis, maybe a natural disaster, maybe even the recent pandemic, where you saw people react in completely opposite ways? Some becoming hyper-vigilant about safety, others throwing caution to the wind. Boccaccio was documenting the same psychological responses 675 years ago. But here's where the Black Death story takes a turn that might surprise you. For those who survived, the plague created opportunities that would have been unimaginable before 1347, and this is where we start to see the birth of ideas that would eventually reshape European society. The most immediate change was economic. With 1/3 of the population dead, labour suddenly became incredibly scarce and valuable. According to the English chronicler Henry Knighton, writing in the 1350s, a man could scarcely get a workman for less than 6 pence a day, when before the plague he could get one for 2 pence. That might not sound like much, but it represents a 300% increase in wages practically overnight. The historian Christopher Dyer, in Standards of Living in the Later Middle Ages, calculates that surviving peasants and labourers saw their purchasing power increase more in the decade after the plague than it had in the previous 2 centuries. But the economic changes went far beyond wages. According to land transfer records from across Europe, the plague created a massive redistribution of property. Entire estates changed hands as noble families died out, creating opportunities for ambitious survivors to accumulate wealth and land on an unprecedented scale. Take the story of Alice de Brienne, whose life the historian Barbara Hannawalt reconstructs in The Wealth of Wives. Alice was a minor landowner's daughter before the plague, but through a combination of strategic marriages to plague survivors and shrewd property investments, she became one of the wealthiest women in 14th century England, controlling estates worth millions in today's money. Alice wasn't unique. The historian Samuel Cohn notes that the decades after the Black Death saw extraordinary social mobility as traditional hierarchies were disrupted and new fortunes were made. It was like a medieval version of a gold rush, except the gold was land, labour and commercial opportunities. But perhaps the most profound changes were cultural and intellectual. The plague forced medieval people to confront questions about mortality, justice, and the meaning of existence in ways that previous generations never had to. And their answers would fundamentally challenge medieval assumptions about society and authority. The historian Carolyn Walker Bynum, in Wonderful Blood, describes how plague survivors developed new forms of religious devotion that emphasized personal relationship with God rather than institutional authority. When traditional religious explanations for the plague proved inadequate, why would a just God kill innocent children while sparing corrupt clergy? People began seeking more direct personal forms of spiritual experience. This led to the rise of mystical movements, lay religious communities, and what the historian Stephen Osman calls the democratization of salvation. Instead of relying entirely on priests and bishops to mediate their relationship with God, ordinary people began reading vernacular translations of religious texts, forming their own prayer groups, and developing their own interpretations of Christian doctrine. The long-term implications of this religious individualism would eventually contribute to the Protestant Reformation, but even in the immediate aftermath of the plague, it represented a fundamental challenge to medieval authority structures. And this brings us to one of the most fascinating aspects of the post-plague world, the emergence of what we might call worker consciousness, centuries before the Industrial Revolution. The historian Rodney Hilton in Bondmen Made Free documents how plague survivors across Europe began organising to demand not just higher wages, but fundamental changes in their legal and social status. The most famous example was the English peasants' revolt of 1381, but similar uprisings occurred in France, Germany, and the Low Countries throughout the late 14th century. What's remarkable about these revolts is how sophisticated their demands were. The English rebels, led by figures like Wat Tyler and John Ball, didn't just want higher wages, they wanted the abolition of serfdom, the redistribution of church lands, and what John Ball famously called the principle that, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? These weren't just economic protests, they were challenges to the entire medieval social order, based on new ideas about human equality and natural rights. And while most of these revolts were eventually suppressed, the ideas they represented would continue to spread and evolve. The historian Samuel Cohn argues that the Black Death marked the beginning of what he calls the first wave of European democratization. The plague had demonstrated that traditional authorities, kings, nobles, clergy, couldn't protect people from catastrophe, so people began questioning whether these authorities deserved their privileged positions. This skepticism toward authority extended beyond politics into intellectual life. The universities that had been dominated by scholastic philosophy began producing scholars who emphasized empirical observation over theoretical speculation. According to the historian Edward Grant in The Foundations of Modern Science in the Middle Ages, many of the intellectual innovations that would later fuel the scientific revolution can be traced back to post-plague questioning of established authorities. But you know what I find most inspiring about the Black Death survivors? They didn't just rebuild medieval society, they built it better. They created new institutions for public health, new forms of social welfare, and new concepts of individual rights that would eventually contribute to the modern world. The historian Julia Calvi, in Histories of a Plague Year, describes how Italian cities developed sophisticated quarantine systems, public health boards, and even early forms of what we'd now call epidemiological surveillance. These weren't just practical responses to disease. They represented new ideas about collective responsibility for public welfare. Similarly, the economic disruptions caused by the plague led to innovations in banking, insurance, and commercial law that would form the foundation of modern capitalism. The historian Jacques Le Goff notes that many of the financial instruments we use today, life insurance, commercial partnerships, international letters of credit, were developed or refined in response to plague-era economic challenges. Have you ever noticed how some of the most important innovations come out of periods of crisis? How catastrophes force people to think creatively and challenge assumptions they might never have questioned otherwise? The Black Death was perhaps the ultimate example of this phenomenon. A tragedy so profound that it forced an entire civilization to reinvent itself. But all of these social and economic changes were happening against the backdrop of another transformation that's equally important to understand: the evolution of medieval military culture. Because while plague survivors were building new forms of society, they were also creating new ideals of individual honour and martial excellence that would define European aristocratic culture for centuries to come. The world was about to meet the knight in shining armour, not as a mythical figure from fairy tales, but as a very real and very complex social institution that combined brutal military efficiency with sophisticated codes of conduct that still influence how we think about courage, honour, and service. Forget everything Hollywood has ever told you about knights. The shining armour, the noble quests, the chivalrous rescues of damsels in distress. Almost all of it is complete fiction. The real story of medieval knights is far more fascinating, far more brutal, and far more human than any movie has ever dared to show you. And it begins with something that might shock you. Most knights weren't noble at all. They were basically medieval special forces operators who happened to own really expensive equipment. Let me introduce you to a man named William Marshall, and his story is going to completely rewrite everything you think you know about knighthood. Born around 1147 as the fourth son of a minor English lord, William had virtually no inheritance and no prospects. According to his biography, the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal, written by an anonymous poet who actually knew him, William's father essentially told him, "You want to eat? Learn to fight." So at age 13, William was sent to Normandy to train in the household of his cousin, William de Tancarville. And what happened there was basically medieval boot camp from hell. The historian David Crouch, in William Marshall Knighthood, War and Chivalry, describes how young knights in training called squires underwent what can only be described as extreme military conditioning. They learned to fight in full armour, which weighed about 60 pounds, while mounted on a warhorse that could weigh over 2,000 pounds and reach speeds of 30 miles per hour. But here's what's going to blow your mind about medieval knight training. It wasn't just about individual combat skills. According to military historian Matthew Strickland in War and Chivalry, knights had to master what was essentially combined arms warfare. They needed to coordinate with archers, work with infantry, understand siegecraft, and execute complex cavalry maneuvers that required split-second timing and absolute trust in their fellow knights. Think about it. A medieval cavalry charge wasn't just a bunch of guys on horses running at the enemy. It was a precisely coordinated military operation where 100 or 200 heavily armoured warriors, each weighing as much as a small car, had to accelerate to maximum speed in perfect formation, strike the enemy line at exactly the right point, and then either break through or wheel around for another attack, all while wearing helmets that severely limited their vision and carrying weapons that required incredible skill to use effectively. And the training never stopped. According to the chronicler Matthew Paris, even experienced knights spent hours every day practicing with weapons, maintaining their equipment, and training their horses. A knight's warhorse, or destrier, was as important as any weapon and required constant conditioning to build the strength and agility needed for combat. But let's talk about the economics of knighthood, because this is where things get really interesting. According to calculations by the historian Michael Prestich in Armies and Warfare in the Middle Ages, equipping a single knight for war cost about as much as a modern luxury car, and that's not counting the horse. A full suit of high-quality armour in the 13th century cost about $20, which doesn't sound like much until you realise that a skilled craftsman might earn $2 per year. So we're talking about 10 years' salary for a single suit of armour. Add in a trained warhorse, another $10, weapons, $5, and the ongoing costs of maintenance and replacement, and you're looking at an investment that would bankrupt most families. This is why knights were essentially a military aristocracy. You couldn't just decide to become a knight. You needed either inherited wealth or a patron willing to invest massive resources in your training and equipment. It was like trying to become a Formula One driver, except instead of racing cars, you were charging into battle with lances and swords. But here's where William Marshall's story gets really fascinating, because he figured out how to turn knighthood into a career path for ambitious young men without inherited wealth. And his secret weapon was something that sounds almost like medieval extreme sports: the tournament circuit. Medieval tournaments weren't the choreographed pageants you see in movies. According to the historian David Crouch, early tournaments were basically legalized warfare conducted under slightly modified rules. Knights would fight in teams, sometimes involving hundreds of participants, across territories that could span several miles. The goal was to capture opponents, hold them for ransom, and confiscate their equipment. William Marshall became what we'd now call a professional athlete on this circuit. According to his biography, between 1170 and 1183, William and his partner Roger de Gougy captured over 500 knights at tournaments, making them incredibly wealthy in the process. William essentially turned medieval combat into a business model. But the biography also reveals something darker about tournament culture. These weren't genteel sporting events. They were violent, dangerous affairs where serious injuries and occasional deaths were common. The chronicler notes that William himself was knocked unconscious multiple times, suffered numerous broken bones, and once had to have his helmet cut off because it had been so badly dented that he couldn't remove it normally. And this brings us to one of the biggest myths about medieval knights: the idea that they were governed by a noble code of chivalry that emphasized honor, courtesy, and protection of the innocent. The reality was far more complicated. The historian Maurice Keene, in Chivalry, explains that chivalric ideals developed gradually over the 12th and 13th centuries as the church and secular authorities tried to channel knightly violence towards socially acceptable targets. But even at its height, chivalry was more aspirational than actual. Take the famous code of chivalry attributed to the legendary Roland, which supposedly required knights to protect the church, defend the weak, and show mercy to defeated enemies. It sounds noble, but according to contemporary chronicles, medieval knights routinely ignored these principles when it was convenient to do so. The historian Jonathan Riley Smith, in The Crusades: A History, documents countless examples of crusader knights who massacred civilian populations, betrayed Christian allies, and fought primarily for personal gain rather than religious ideals. Even the most celebrated knights of the age were capable of shocking brutality when their interests were at stake. But here's what's really fascinating about medieval knights. They were simultaneously brutal warriors and sophisticated politicians who understood that reputation and relationships were as important as military skill. Take the case of Bertrand du Guesclin, a 14th century French knight whose career the historian Richard Vernier analyses in The Flower of Chivalry. Bertrand was famously ugly. Contemporaries described him as looking more like a pig farmer than a noble warrior. But he became one of the most successful knights of his era through a combination of military brilliance, political cunning, and what we'd now call personal branding. Bertrand deliberately cultivated an image as a knight of the people, who fought for France rather than personal gain. He shared booty with his men, treated prisoners well, and carefully managed his public reputation. According to Vernier, Bertrand understood that in an age of competing loyalties and shifting alliances, a knight's most valuable asset was his credibility. This political sophistication was typical of successful knights. The historian Michael Jones, in The Black Prince, describes how Edward of Woodstock, the famous Black Prince, spent as much time on diplomacy, alliance building and propaganda as he did on actual fighting. Medieval warfare was as much about perception and psychology as it was about military force. But you know what I find most interesting about medieval knights? They were constantly adapting to technological change in ways that required incredible intellectual flexibility and practical intelligence. The development of gunpowder weapons in the 14th and 15th centuries could have made knights obsolete overnight. Instead, according to military historian Kelly DeVries in Medieval Military Technology, knights evolved their tactics, modified their equipment, and found new roles on changing battlefields. Italian knights in the 15th century, for example, became pioneers in the use of mounted firearms. German knights developed new armour designs that could deflect early bullets. English knights learned to fight as dismounted men-at-arms alongside archers and early gunpowder units. The most successful knights weren't those who clung to tradition. They were innovators who understood that survival required constant adaptation to new technologies and changing tactical environments. And this brings us to something that might surprise you. Social mobility through knighthood was actually quite common, especially in frontier regions where military skill mattered more than family connections. The historian Jonathan Phillips in the Second Crusade tells the story of Geoffrey de Montfort, who started as a landless knight in the service of others, but eventually became lord of several castles through military success and strategic marriages. Geoffrey's career illustrates how knighthood could serve as a pathway to social advancement for talented individuals willing to risk their lives for advancement. Similarly, the Spanish Reconquista created opportunities for knights of humble origin to gain land and status through military service. According to the historian Joseph O'Callaghan in Reconquest and Crusade in medieval Spain, the constant warfare against Muslim states meant that Spanish kings needed skilled warriors more than they needed nobles with impressive pedigrees. Have you ever been in a situation where your skills and performance mattered more than your background or connections? Where you had to prove yourself through action rather than credentials? Medieval knighthood, at its best, was exactly that kind of meritocratic system, brutal and dangerous, but offering real opportunities for advancement based on ability and courage. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about medieval knights was their role in developing what we'd now call professional military ethics. Despite all their flaws and contradictions, knights did create traditions of military honour that continue to influence modern armed forces. The historian Malcolm Vale in War and Chivalry describes how knightly codes emphasized concepts like loyalty to comrades, protection of non-combatants, and honorable treatment of prisoners that became foundational principles of the laws of war. These weren't always followed, but they represented aspirational standards that pushed military culture toward greater humanity and professionalism. The famous Order of the Garter, founded by Edward III of England in 1348, institutionalized these ideals in ways that influenced military culture across Europe. According to its founding statutes, preserved in the British National Archives, members swore to uphold honour, loyalty and courtesy in all their dealings, whether in war or peace. But here's what's really remarkable. While knights were developing these sophisticated codes of military honour, medieval society was also producing women who wielded political, economic, and even military power in ways that would shock most modern audiences. These weren't passive damsels in distress waiting to be rescued. They were formidable leaders who shaped the course of medieval history through intelligence, determination, and sheer force of personality. From warrior queens who led armies into battle, to abbesses who controlled vast economic networks, to scholars who advanced human knowledge in ways that wouldn't be matched for centuries, medieval women were far more powerful and influential than most people realize. And their stories are about to challenge everything you think you know about gender, power, and opportunity in the medieval world. The most powerful person in 12th century Europe wasn't a king, an emperor, or a pope. She was a woman who controlled more territory than the King of France, led armies on crusade, patronized the greatest artists and poets of her age, and managed to outlive 2 husbands while maintaining her independence in a world supposedly dominated by men. Her name was Eleanor of Aquitaine, and her story is about to demolish every assumption you've ever had about medieval women. But Eleanor wasn't unusual. She was just the most famous example of something historians are only now beginning to fully understand. Medieval women wielded far more power, influence, and authority than centuries of male historians ever bothered to document. Let's start with Eleanor's resume, because it reads like something out of a political thriller. Born around 1122, she inherited the Duchy of Aquitaine, which covered about 1/3 of modern France, when she was just 15 years old. According to the historian Amy Kelly in Eleanor of Aquitaine and the Four Kings, this made Eleanor not just the richest heiress in Europe, but arguably the most powerful feudal lord on the continent. Think about that for a moment. At 15, Eleanor controlled more land than most kings, commanded the loyalty of hundreds of nobles, and had annual revenues that dwarfed the royal treasuries of England and France. She wasn't some helpless medieval maiden waiting to be married off. She was a CEO who happened to be a teenager. And when Eleanor did marry, she didn't disappear into domestic obscurity. Her first marriage to Louis VII of France made her Queen of France, but according to the chronicler Odo of Douai, Eleanor essentially ran the kingdom's foreign policy. When Louis decided to go on the Second Crusade in 1147, Eleanor didn't stay home to tend the hearth. She raised her own army and accompanied him to the Holy Land. The historian John Julius Norwich, in Four Princes, describes how Eleanor arrived in Antioch with what he calls a retinue fit for an empress, hundreds of knights, servants, and camp followers, plus siege engines, supplies, and enough treasure to finance military operations. She wasn't just going on crusade as a royal wife, she was leading her own military expedition. But here's where Eleanor's story gets really interesting, and where it challenges everything you think you know about medieval marriage and women's rights. When Eleanor's marriage to Louis VII became politically inconvenient, they had only produced daughters, and Louis needed a male heir. Eleanor didn't just passively accept annulment. She negotiated the terms. According to the legal historian Emily Ampt in Women's Lives in Medieval Europe, Eleanor's annulment agreement allowed her to retain full control of Aquitaine, keep her personal property, and choose her own second husband. In 1152 she married Henry Plantagenet, who would become Henry II of England, making Eleanor Queen of England while remaining Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right. This wasn't unusual, it was just well documented because Eleanor was so prominent. Medieval women, especially aristocratic women, had legal rights that would shock most modern people. According to the legal historian Sue Sheridan Walker, in Wife and Widow in Medieval England, medieval English law recognised women's rights to own property, conduct business, sue in court, and even lead military forces under certain circumstances. Take the case of Nicolas de la Haye, whose story the historian David Crouch tells in The Birth of Nobility. When Nicola's husband died in 1202, she inherited not just his lands but his position as Sheriff of Lincolnshire, one of the most important administrative posts in England. For the next 20 years, Nicola collected taxes, administered justice, and defended her castle against military attacks. She was essentially running a county government while most of Europe was at war. But let's talk about women in medieval business, because this is where the gap between historical reality and popular perception becomes absolutely staggering. The historian Martha Howell, in Women, Production and Patriarchy in Late Medieval Cities, has documented thousands of medieval businesswomen who ran everything from international trading companies to major manufacturing operations. Consider Marjorie Kempe, whose autobiography, the first autobiography written in English, reveals a life that would impress any modern entrepreneur. According to her own account, written around 1430, Marjorie ran a brewing business that employed multiple workers, operated a horse mill that processed grain for local farmers, and managed real estate investments across Norfolk. She wasn't just economically active, she was what we'd now call a serial entrepreneur. Or take the story of Rose of Burford, whose business career the historian Kay Lacey reconstructs in Women and Work in 14th and 15th century London. Rose started as an apprentice in the London wool trade, but by 1380 she was running her own company that exported English wool to Flanders and imported luxury goods back to England. According to customs records, Rose's annual business volume was larger than that of most male merchants. The Hanseatic League records show that women constituted about 30% of the merchant class in cities like Hamburg and Lübeck. These weren't just merchants' wives helping with family businesses. They were independent operators who owned ships, negotiated contracts, and competed directly with male colleagues. But perhaps the most remarkable medieval woman you've never heard of was Hildegard of Bingen, and her achievements are so impressive that they sound almost impossible. Born around 1098, Hildegard was a Benedictine abbess who became one of the most influential intellectuals of the 12th century. According to the historian Barbara Newman in Voice of the Living Light, Hildegard wrote extensively on medicine, natural science, theology, and music. Her medical text, Physica, was used in European universities for centuries and contained observations about human anatomy and disease that wouldn't be matched until the Renaissance. Her musical compositions, she wrote over 70 songs, introduced harmonic innovations that influenced European music for generations. But Hildegard wasn't just a scholar. She was a political power broker who corresponded with popes, emperors, and kings. According to her collected letters, analysed by the historian Catherine Kirby Fulton in Books Under Suspicion, Hildegard regularly advised political leaders on everything from military strategy to economic policy. When she thought they were making mistakes, she told them so in terms that would make a modern political consultant blush. In one famous letter to Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Hildegard wrote, "You are acting like a small child. You do not see how you are being led astray by your advisers." This wasn't some powerless medieval nun being deferential to authority. This was a woman telling the Holy Roman Emperor that he was an idiot. And Hildegard's influence extended far beyond her lifetime. The historian Caroline Walker Bynum, in Holy Feast and Holy Fast, describes how Hildegard's theological writings helped shape medieval concepts of mysticism and spiritual experience. Her scientific observations contributed to the development of medieval medicine, and her musical innovations influenced the evolution of European classical music. But if you want to talk about medieval women who changed history, we have to discuss Joan of Arc, whose story is so remarkable that it still seems almost mythical. According to the trial records preserved in the French National Archives, and we have detailed transcripts because Joan's English captors were obsessed with documenting her supposed heresy, Joan convinced the French court that she had received divine visions commanding her to drive the English out of France. The historian Deborah Frioli, in Joan of Arc, The Early Debate, notes that what's most remarkable about Joan isn't just that she claimed divine inspiration, but that she managed to convince sophisticated political and military leaders to give her actual command authority. In 1429, at age 17, Joan was given control of French armies and began a military campaign that changed the course of the 100 Years' War. The military historian Kelly de Vries, in Joan of Arc, A Military Leader, analyses Joan's tactical innovations and concludes that she was genuinely skilled at medieval warfare. She understood siegecraft, cavalry tactics, and the psychological dimensions of military leadership. Joan wasn't just an inspirational figurehead. She was an effective military commander who won battles through superior strategy and tactics. But Joan's story also reveals something important about medieval attitudes toward women and authority. According to the historian Marina Warner in Joan of Arc, The Image of Female Heroism, Joan's success was possible partly because medieval people believed that God could work through anyone, including young women, to accomplish divine purposes. This created opportunities for exceptional women to exercise authority that would have been impossible in more rigidly patriarchal societies. And this brings us to something that might surprise you. Medieval religious institutions were often the most progressive employers of women in European society. The historian Joanne McNamara, in Sisters in Arms, documents how medieval nunneries weren't just places where women went to pray. They were economic powerhouses that controlled vast amounts of land, ran schools and hospitals, and wielded significant political influence. Take the Abbey of Fontevraud in France, which according to the historian Bruce Vernard in Women's Monasticism and Medieval Society, controlled over 100 priories across Europe and had annual revenues that rivaled those of small kingdoms. The Abbess of Fontevraud wasn't just a religious leader, she was essentially the CEO of a multinational corporation that happened to be dedicated to Christian service. Similarly, the historian Alison Beach, in Women as Scribes, has documented how medieval nunneries were centres of learning and manuscript production. Female scribes copied and illuminated books, preserved classical texts, and even authored original works. The famous Civius manuscript containing Hildegard of Bingen's visions was produced entirely by nuns who were among the most skilled artists and calligraphers of their era. But you know what I find most interesting about medieval women? They understood something that modern women are still fighting for: the importance of economic independence and political networks. Medieval businesswomen like Marjorie Kemp and Rose of Burford didn't just run successful companies. They invested their profits in ways that gave them long-term security and political influence. According to the historian P.J.P. Goldberg in Women, Work and Life Cycle in a Medieval Economy, successful medieval businesswomen typically diversified their investments across real estate, trade goods, and what we'd now call venture capital, funding other women's business ventures in exchange for shares of future profits. Have you ever noticed how some of the most successful women in any era are those who build their own economic base rather than depending entirely on family connections? Medieval women figured this out centuries ago, and they created networks of mutual support that helped women across Europe achieve independence and influence. The historian Marianne Kowaleski, in Local Markets and Regional Trade in Medieval Exeter, describes how medieval businesswomen formed what she calls commercial sisterhoods, informal networks that shared market information, provided credit, and helped members navigate legal and political challenges. These networks were sophisticated enough to span multiple countries and operate across linguistic and cultural barriers. But perhaps the most important thing to understand about medieval women is that their stories were systematically erased or minimized by later historians who couldn't imagine that women had ever wielded real power. The historian Judith Bennett, in History Matters, argues that the medieval misogyny we read about in textbooks was often the product of 19th and early 20th century historians who projected their own assumptions about gender roles back onto the medieval past. When you actually look at medieval legal records, business documents, and contemporary chronicles, a very different picture emerges. Women appear as property owners, business partners, legal advocates, political advisors, and military leaders. They weren't exceptions to some general rule of female oppression. They were part of a society that, while certainly patriarchal, was also remarkably flexible about gender roles when practical necessity demanded it. This doesn't mean medieval society was a feminist paradise. Women certainly face significant legal and social constraints, but it does mean that the reality was far more complex and interesting than the simple narrative of medieval female powerlessness that most of us learned in school. And this complexity becomes even more evident when we look at how medieval society channeled its resources and ambitions into some of the most ambitious construction projects in human history. Because while women like Eleanor and Hildegard were wielding political and intellectual power, medieval Europe was also embarking on a building boom that would create some of the most magnificent structures ever conceived. Monuments that required the coordination of thousands of workers, revolutionary engineering techniques, and financial resources that stretched across continents. The age of cathedral building was about to transform not just European skylines, but European society itself, creating new forms of community, new technologies, and new ways of thinking about human potential that would echo through the centuries. Standing beneath the soaring vaults of Notre Dame Cathedral, looking up at stone arches that seem to defy gravity itself, you're witnessing something that medieval people considered literally impossible until they figured out how to do it. These weren't just buildings, they were impossible dreams made manifest in stone, engineering marvels that pushed the boundaries of human knowledge, and economic projects so massive that they transformed entire civilizations in the process of their construction. Welcome to the greatest construction boom in human history, where medieval Europe embarked on a building spree that makes modern infrastructure projects look like backyard sheds. Let me tell you about a man named Suger, and his story is going to change how you think about innovation, ambition, and the power of impossible dreams. Around 1137, Suger became abbot of the monastery of Saint-Denis, just outside Paris. According to his own writings, collected in on the abbey church of Saint Denis, Suger looked at his monastery's dark, cramped Carolingian church and decided to do something that no one had ever attempted before: build a structure that would fill a sacred space with divine light. The problem was that medieval church architecture was essentially a series of engineering compromises. According to the architectural historian Christopher Wilson in the Gothic Cathedral, Romanesque churches had to choose between height and light. You could build thick walls that supported great weight but blocked out sunlight, or you could create large windows but sacrifice structural integrity. Suger's revolutionary insight was that this was a false choice. Working with master masons whose names are lost to history, he developed what would become known as Gothic architecture, a system of pointed arches, flying buttresses and ribbed vaults that could support incredible weight while opening up walls for massive windows. But here's what's absolutely mind-blowing about what Suger accomplished. According to his building accounts, analysed by the historian Lindy Grant in Abbot Suger of Saint-Denis, the reconstruction of Saint-Denis required innovations in metallurgy, mathematics, logistics, and project management that wouldn't be seen again until the Industrial Revolution. Consider just the engineering challenges. A Gothic cathedral like Saint-Denis required lifting stones weighing several tons to heights of over 100 feet, with tolerances measured in millimeters. The flying buttresses had to transfer lateral forces through complex geometric calculations that required understanding principles of physics that wouldn't be formally codified for centuries. The master mason who designed Saint-Denis, we don't even know his name, which tells you something about medieval attitudes towards celebrity, essentially invented structural engineering as a discipline. According to the engineering historian Santiago Huerta in The Mechanics of Gothic Architecture, Gothic builders developed mathematical techniques for calculating load distributions, stress patterns, and material strengths that were more sophisticated than anything taught in medieval universities, and they did all of this without computers, without advanced mathematics, without modern materials science. They solved impossibly complex engineering problems through empirical observation trial and error, and what can only be described as inspired intuition. But the technical innovations were just the beginning. According to the economic historian Richard Britnell in The Commercialization of English Society, cathedral building created the world's first truly integrated supply chains, connecting quarries in Normandy with forests in Scandinavia, metal workers in Germany with glass artists in Venice. Take the construction of Chartres Cathedral, which the historian Malcolm Miller documents in Chartres Cathedral. The project required blue limestone from quarries near Paris, oak timber from forests in northern France, lead for the roof from mines in England, and coloured glass that came from workshops across Europe. Coordinating these supply chains required logistical sophistication that wouldn't be matched until the age of global shipping. But here's what's really remarkable. Medieval cathedral builders created what we'd now call just-in-time delivery systems centuries before the concept was formally developed. Stone arrived at construction sites precisely when it was needed, pre-cut to exact specifications with waste kept to absolute minimums. According to surviving building accounts from Exeter Cathedral, analysed by the historian John Harvey in The Master Builders, medieval construction projects achieved efficiency ratios that would impress modern project managers. And the scale of these projects was absolutely staggering. According to calculations by the historian Robert Mark in Experiments in Gothic Structure, Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris required approximately 100,000 tons of stone, 500 tons of iron, and 400 tons of lead. The project employed over 300 craftsmen at peak construction, plus hundreds of labourers, suppliers and support workers. To put that in perspective, building Notre Dame was equivalent to constructing a modern skyscraper, except medieval builders had to quarry and transport every stone by hand, lift everything using simple machines, and solve engineering problems that no one had ever faced before. But what I find most fascinating about cathedral building is the human element. The stories of the individual craftsmen who dedicated their entire lives to projects they knew they would never see completed. Take the case of Jean de Chelles, master mason of Notre Dame Cathedral from 1258 to 1265. According to records preserved in the cathedral archives, Jean spent 7 years of his life working on the south transept, perfecting details that most visitors would never notice, but that he considered essential to the building's spiritual and aesthetic integrity. Jean knew that he was contributing to something that would outlast him by centuries. According to the historian Lon Shelby in Gothic Design Techniques, medieval master masons left detailed drawings and instructions for their successors, understanding that these buildings were collaborative projects spanning multiple generations. This multi-generational thinking created a unique culture of craftsmanship, where individual ego was subordinated to collective achievement. Master masons, stone carvers, glassmakers and metalworkers all understood that their individual contributions were meaningful only as part of a larger whole. And this brings us to something that might surprise you. Cathedral building was essentially a medieval venture capital system that funded technological innovation on an unprecedented scale. According to the historian Caroline Bruzelius in Preaching, Building and Burying, cathedral chapters functioned like modern research and development laboratories, constantly experimenting with new techniques, materials, and designs. The financial resources required for these experiments came from a complex mix of donations, investments, and what we'd now call revenue diversification. Chartres Cathedral, for example, wasn't just funded by religious donations. According to the historian John James in The Contractors of Chartres, the cathedral chapter operated commercial ventures including wool trading, wine production, and financial services. The cathedral essentially became a medieval corporation that used its economic activities to fund architectural innovation. But the most remarkable aspect of cathedral building might be how it transformed the cities where these projects were undertaken. According to the urban historian David Nicholas in The Growth of the Medieval City, cathedral construction created economic boom towns that attracted craftsmen, merchants, and entrepreneurs from across Europe. Reims, site of one of the greatest Gothic cathedrals, grew from a minor provincial town to a major commercial centre during the 13th century construction boom. According to tax records analysed by the historian Theodore Evergates in The Aristocracy in the County of Champagne, the city's population tripled during the cathedral building period as workers, suppliers, and service providers flocked to the construction site. Similar patterns occurred across Europe. According to the historian Christopher Brooke in The Age of the Cloister, cathedral cities became centres of innovation not just in architecture, but in banking, manufacturing, and international trade. The economic networks created to support cathedral construction evolved into the commercial systems that would fuel Europe's later economic expansion. Have you ever been part of a project so ambitious, so inspiring, that it attracted talented people from everywhere and created opportunities that no one had imagined when the project began? Medieval cathedral building was essentially that phenomenon on a continental scale. But perhaps the most important legacy of cathedral building was cultural rather than economic or technological. According to the art historian Erwin Panofsky in Gothic Architecture and Scholasticism, Gothic cathedrals represented a new way of thinking about human potential and divine purpose. These buildings were designed to overwhelm visitors with their scale, beauty, and technical sophistication. They were meant to demonstrate that human beings, working together and inspired by divine purpose, could accomplish things that seemed literally impossible. The historian Otto von Simpson, in The Gothic Cathedral, describes how these buildings were intended to be sermons in stone that taught theological concepts through architectural experience. Standing inside Sainte-Chapelle in Paris, surrounded by walls of coloured glass that seemed to dissolve the boundary between earth and heaven, medieval visitors experienced something that no previous generation had ever encountered: architecture as transcendent art that demonstrated human capability to create beauty that approached the divine. But while European craftsmen were pushing the boundaries of architectural possibility and creating new forms of transcendent beauty, the political landscape was about to be shattered by a conflict so prolonged, so devastating, and so complex that it would make Game of Thrones look like a simple family disagreement. The stage was being set for a war that would span over a century, involve every major European power, introduce revolutionary military technologies, and ultimately reshape the entire concept of nationhood in ways that still influence our world today. Welcome to the 100 Years' War, where medieval chivalry met gunpowder reality, where teenage peasant girls became military commanders, and where the very meaning of France and England was forged in the crucible of constant warfare. In 1337, two kings went to war over an inheritance dispute that most people today couldn't explain in 100 words. By the time their conflict finally ended in 1453, it had consumed 5 generations, revolutionized military technology, bankrupted kingdoms, and created the foundation myths that France and England still tell about themselves today. And it all started because nobody could agree on a family tree. But here's what's going to surprise you about the 100 Years' War. It wasn't really about the things most people think it was about. It wasn't a straightforward national conflict between France and England. It wasn't a simple feudal dispute over territory. And it definitely wasn't the chivalrous, honour-bound warfare that medieval chroniclers like to describe. The 100 Years' War was actually the world's first modern conflict, a total war that transformed economies, societies, and military technology in ways that would define European warfare for the next 400 years. Let's start with the family drama that started it all, because it reads like a medieval soap opera with continental implications. When Charles IV of France died in 1328 without a male heir, according to the Chronicle of Jean Froissart, there were essentially three claimants to the French throne: Philip of Valois, Charles's cousin, Edward III of England, Charles's nephew through his mother, and Charles of Navarre, Charles's nephew through his sister. Now, if this were just a normal inheritance dispute, the French nobles would have chosen a king and everyone else would have grumbled and moved on. But Edward III of England had a problem. He was also Duke of Aquitaine, which meant he owed feudal allegiance to whoever became King of France. According to the legal scholar Joseph Strayer in The Reign of Philip the Fair, this created an impossible situation where Edward would have to pay homage to his rival claimant. Edward's solution was brilliantly audacious. Instead of accepting Philip VI as his feudal overlord, he declared himself the rightful King of France and launched a military campaign to claim his inheritance. In 1340, according to the historian Jonathan Sumption in The 100 Years' War Trial by Battle, Edward formally assumed the title King of France and England, setting up a conflict that would define European politics for the next century. But here's what makes this war so fascinating from a military history perspective. It began in one technological era and ended in a completely different one. The early battles of the 100 Years' War were dominated by heavily armoured knights, fighting with lances and swords. By the end, gunpowder weapons had made traditional medieval warfare obsolete. The transformation began at the Battle of Crécy in 1346, and what happened there is going to change how you think about technological disruption forever. According to the detailed account by the chronicler Jean le Bel, Edward III's army included about 7,000 English longbowmen facing a French force that included over 2,500 knights, the cream of European heavy cavalry. The military historian Jim Bradbury, in The Medieval Archer, explains how the English longbow was essentially a precision weapon system that could penetrate armour at ranges up to 250 yards. A skilled archer could shoot 12 arrows per minute, which meant that 7,000 bowmen could deliver over 80,000 arrows in the time it took heavy cavalry to cross a battlefield. The result was a massacre. According to Froissart's chronicle, the French lost over 1,500 knights at Crécy, including King John of Bohemia, the Count of Alençon, and dozens of other high nobles. The English losses were estimated at fewer than 100 men. It was like watching a medieval version of machine guns versus cavalry charges. But here's what's really remarkable about Crécy. It demonstrated that superior technology and tactics could overcome traditional military superiority almost overnight. The French had more knights, better armour, and centuries of military tradition. The English had innovative weapons, superior tactics, and the willingness to break the established rules of medieval warfare. The historian Clifford Rogers, in War Cruel and Sharp, argues that Crécy marked the beginning of what he calls the military revolution, a transformation in warfare that would eventually make gunpowder weapons, professional armies, and centralised state power the dominant features of European military culture. But the 100 Years' War wasn't just a military conflict. It was also an economic war that transformed how European states raised money, organised resources, and mobilised populations for extended conflicts. According to the financial historian Michael Prestwich in Plantagenet, England, Edward III's war effort required innovations in taxation, borrowing, and financial administration that created the foundation of the modern state. To fund his campaigns, Edward had to negotiate with Parliament for new taxes, borrow money from Italian bankers, and develop new forms of revenue collection that reached deeper into English society than any previous government had attempted. The war effort essentially forced England to develop a more sophisticated fiscal state centuries ahead of most European kingdoms. Similarly, according to the historian John Bell Henneman in Royal Taxation in 14th century France, the French monarchy had to develop new administrative capabilities to compete with English military innovations. The war created pressure for governmental reform, fiscal innovation, and administrative centralization that would eventually produce the absolutist monarchy of later centuries. But while kings and ministers were revolutionizing state finance and military organization, the actual conduct of the war was becoming increasingly brutal and destructive. The chivalrous ideals that supposedly governed medieval warfare quickly gave way to what historian Maurice Keene calls a pitiless professionalism that targeted civilian populations as deliberately as military forces. The English strategy of chevauchée, essentially organised raids designed to destroy French economic resources, brought warfare to a level of systematic destruction that hadn't been seen in Western Europe since the Viking raids. According to the chronicler Thomas Walsingham, English forces in the 1350s deliberately burned crops, destroyed mills, killed livestock, and targeted civilian infrastructure with the goal of making French territories economically unviable. The human cost was staggering. The historian Nicholas Wright in Knights and Peasants estimates that repeated English raids reduced the population of some French regions by as much as 50% between 1340 and 1380. Combined with the effects of the Black Death, the 100 Years' War created demographic catastrophes that took generations to recover from. But then, just when it seemed like the war had settled into a pattern of English dominance and French decline, something unprecedented happened. A teenage peasant girl from the village of Domremy claimed to have received visions from saints telling her to drive the English out of France and restore the Dauphin to his throne. Joan of Arc's story has been told so many times that it's easy to forget how absolutely impossible her success must have seemed to contemporary observers. According to the trial records preserved in the French National Archives, Joan convinced the court at Chinon not just that her visions were genuine, but that a 17-year-old girl with no military training should be given command of French armies attempting to break the siege of Orléans. What happened next defies every assumption about medieval warfare, gender roles, and military leadership. According to the journal kept by Percival de Cagny, one of Joan's companions, Joan didn't just inspire French troops, she revolutionized French military tactics by emphasizing aggressive offense over defensive positions, rapid movement over siege warfare, and morale factors over purely technical considerations. The historian Kelly de Vries, in Joan of Arc, a Military Leader, analyzes Joan's campaigns and concludes that she was genuinely innovative as a military commander. She understood how to coordinate different types of forces, how to exploit English tactical weaknesses, and most importantly, how to restore French confidence after decades of military defeats. Joan's victory at Orléans in 1429 marked the beginning of a French recovery that would eventually drive English forces out of all French territory except Calais. But perhaps more importantly, Joan's success demonstrated something that would have profound implications for European political development: the power of nationalist ideology to overcome military and economic disadvantages. According to the historian Malcolm Vail in Charles VII, Joan's campaigns weren't just military operations, they were exercises in what we'd now call propaganda and psychological warfare. She successfully convinced French soldiers, civilians, and eventually foreign observers that the war was not just a dynastic conflict between rival kings, but a struggle between French national identity and foreign occupation. This transformation of a feudal inheritance dispute into a proto-nationalist struggle would have lasting consequences far beyond the immediate military situation. According to the historian Craig Taylor in Joan of Arc and the 100 Years' War, Joan's success created the first modern example of popular nationalism overcoming military and technological disadvantages through sheer determination and superior morale. But Joan's personal story ended tragically. Captured by Burgundian allies of the English in 1430, she was handed over to English authorities who were determined to prove that her military success had been the result of witchcraft rather than divine inspiration or military skill. According to her trial transcripts, analysed by the historian Deborah Fraioli in Joan of Arc, The Early Debate, Joan's English captors understood that her symbolic importance was as dangerous as her military capabilities. Joan was burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431, but by then the transformation she had initiated was irreversible. French forces continued the military recovery she'd begun, and by 1453, English territories in France had been reduced to the single port city of Calais. But the end of the 100 Years' War marked the beginning of something even more significant: the emergence of England and France as distinct national entities with different political systems, different military traditions, and different relationships between monarchs and subjects. According to the historian Christopher Almond in The 100 Years' War, the long conflict had forced both kingdoms to develop governmental capabilities, military technologies, and national consciousness that would make them the dominant powers in early modern Europe. The war that had begun as a medieval inheritance dispute had ended with the creation of the first modern nation-states. Have you ever noticed how some conflicts that start for one reason end up being about something completely different? How wars that begin over specific disagreements sometimes create changes that nobody anticipated when the fighting started? The 100 Years' War was perhaps the ultimate example of this phenomenon, a conflict that began with medieval assumptions and ended with modern realities. But while England and France were learning how to be nation-states through a century of warfare, something even more revolutionary was happening in the intellectual and cultural life of Europe. New ideas about human potential, individual achievement, and the possibilities of earthly life were beginning to challenge medieval assumptions about hierarchy, authority, and the proper relationship between earthly and divine concerns. The Renaissance was beginning to bloom across Europe, bringing with it new forms of art, new approaches to knowledge, and new concepts of human dignity that would ultimately create the foundation of the modern world. And it all started with a group of Italian scholars who decided that the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome might have something important to teach medieval Christians. What if I told you that the Renaissance, that great flowering of art, science, and human achievement that supposedly marked the end of the Dark Ages, actually began in the middle of what we call the medieval period, was driven by medieval institutions, and represented not a break with medieval culture but its ultimate fulfillment? Well, prepare to have everything you thought you knew about the relationship between medieval and modern Europe completely turned upside down. The story begins around 1304 in a small Italian town called Arezzo, where a young man named Francesco Petrarca, we know him as Petrarch, made a discovery that would change the course of Western civilization. According to his own letters, collected in Letters on Familiar Matters, Petrarch found a manuscript of Cicero's letters in the Cathedral library and experienced what he called a thunderbolt of recognition. Reading Cicero's elegant Latin prose and sophisticated political analysis, Petrarch realized that the ancient Romans had achieved levels of literary and intellectual excellence that had been lost for centuries. But here's what's remarkable about Petrarch's response. Instead of simply admiring ancient achievement, he decided to revive it. According to the Renaissance historian Paul Christella in Renaissance Thought, Petrarch began what he called the recovery of antiquity, a systematic effort to find, copy and study ancient Greek and Roman texts that had been preserved in medieval monasteries and cathedral libraries. But Petrarch wasn't just an antiquarian collector. He was a cultural revolutionary who believed that studying ancient wisdom could create a new kind of educated person for his own time. Petrarch coined the term Dark Ages to describe the period between the fall of Rome and his own era. But here's the irony. The manuscripts he needed for his recovery of antiquity had been preserved by medieval monks, copied by medieval scribes, and housed in medieval libraries. The Renaissance didn't emerge despite medieval culture, it emerged because of medieval culture. Take the example of the Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino, which according to the historian Anselm Strittmatter in the manuscript tradition of Cassino, had been copying and preserving classical texts for over 700 years when Petrarch began his collecting efforts. Medieval monasteries weren't centres of ignorance and superstition. They were libraries, scriptoriums, and research institutions that had kept alive the intellectual heritage of the ancient world. But Petrarch and his followers did something revolutionary with this preserved knowledge. They began to read ancient texts not just as sources of information, but as models for how contemporary people might live, write, and think. According to the historian Hans Baron in The Crisis of the Early Italian Renaissance, this created what he calls civic humanism, a new educational philosophy that emphasized individual achievement, active engagement with the world, and the possibility of human excellence. The results were spectacular. Within a generation, according to the historian Jacob Burckhardt in The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy, Italian cities were producing artists, writers, and thinkers whose achievements rivaled those of ancient Athens and Rome. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Machiavelli, Galileo. These weren't just talented individuals, they were products of educational systems and cultural environments that had been deliberately designed to foster human excellence. But here's what's really remarkable about the Renaissance. It wasn't limited to Italy, and it wasn't limited to elite culture. According to the historian Dennis Hay in The Italian Renaissance in its Historical Background, Renaissance ideas and techniques spread across Europe through networks of merchants, diplomats, scholars, and artists who carried new approaches to art, learning, and social organization to every corner of the continent. Take the printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440. According to the historian Elizabeth Eisenstein in The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, Gutenberg's innovation wasn't just a technological breakthrough, it was a cultural revolution that made books affordable, accessible, and standardized in ways that transformed European intellectual life. Before printing, according to calculations by the historian Lucien Febvre in The Coming of the Book, a hand-copied book might cost the equivalent of several months' wages for a skilled craftsman. After printing became established, the same book might cost the equivalent of a day's wages. This price revolution put books within reach of merchants, professionals, and even some skilled workers for the first time in European history. The consequences were staggering. According to Eisenstein's research, by 1500, just 60 years after Gutenberg's first printed Bible, over 35,000 different titles had been printed in Europe, with total production estimated at over 15 million books. This represented more books than had been produced in the entire previous millennium of European history. But the printing revolution wasn't just about quantity, it was about the democratization of knowledge. According to the historian Roger Chartier in The Order of Books, printing made it possible for the first time in European history for ordinary people to own books, compare different texts, and develop their own interpretations of everything from religious doctrine to political theory. This intellectual democratization had profound political implications. The historian Quentin Skinner in The Foundations of Modern Political Thought describes how Renaissance thinkers developed new theories of government, law, and individual rights that would eventually challenge medieval assumptions about hierarchy, authority, and the divine right of kings. Take Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince, written around 1513. According to the political theorist Isaiah Berlin in The Originality of Machiavelli, this wasn't just a manual for rulers, It was a revolutionary analysis that separated political effectiveness from moral virtue and suggested that successful government required understanding human nature as it actually is rather than as it ought to be. Similarly, Renaissance legal scholars like Bartolus de Saxo-Ferrato developed new approaches to law that emphasized rational analysis over traditional authority. According to the legal historian Harold Berman in Law and Revolution, these innovations created the intellectual foundation for modern concepts of constitutional government, individual rights, and the rule of law. But perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of Renaissance culture was its new approach to artistic and scientific observation. Medieval art had emphasized spiritual symbolism over realistic representation. Renaissance artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Albrecht Dürer pioneered techniques of perspective, anatomy, and naturalistic representation that required careful observation of the physical world. According to the art historian Kenneth Clark in Leonardo da Vinci, Leonardo's notebooks reveal a mind that was simultaneously artistic and scientific, approaching painting, engineering, anatomy, and natural philosophy as interconnected aspects of a single inquiry into how the world actually works. Leonardo's famous drawing of the Vitruvian Man wasn't just an artistic masterpiece. It was a statement about the dignity and complexity of human beings as natural creatures worthy of careful study. This emphasis on empirical observation created the intellectual foundation for what would become the scientific revolution. According to the historian of science Edward Grant in The Foundations of Modern Science in the Middle Ages, Renaissance scholars like Copernicus, Vesalius, and Galileo built on observational techniques and mathematical methods that had been developed by medieval scholars, but applied them to new questions with revolutionary results. Take Nicholas Copernicus, whose On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, 1543, proposed that the Earth orbited the Sun rather than vice versa. According to the historian Owen Gingerich in the book Nobody Read, Copernicus wasn't rejecting medieval astronomy. He was using mathematical techniques developed by medieval Islamic and Christian scholars to solve problems that medieval astronomers had identified but couldn't resolve. But the Renaissance wasn't just about individual genius. It was about creating new institutions and social environments that could nurture and support innovative thinking. According to the historian Lisa Jardine in Worldly Goods, Renaissance cities like Florence, Venice, and Antwerp developed what we'd now call innovation ecosystems, where artists, scholars, merchants, and craftsmen could collaborate on projects that none of them could have completed individually. The Medici Bank, for example, wasn't just a financial institution. It was a cultural patron that funded artists, scholars, and architects while building commercial networks that connected Florence with the rest of Europe. According to the business historian Raymond de Ruver in The Rise and Decline of the Medici Bank, the Medici understood that cultural investment and commercial success were mutually reinforcing strategies. Similarly, Renaissance universities like the University of Padua developed new approaches to education that emphasized critical thinking, empirical observation, and practical application, rather than just memorization of traditional authorities. According to the historian Paul Grendler in The Universities of the Italian Renaissance, these institutions created new types of educated professionals who could serve as administrators, diplomats, and technical experts in an increasingly complex European society. But you know what I find most inspiring about the Renaissance? It demonstrates that cultural transformation is possible when societies create environments that reward innovation, support experimentation, and value human achievement. The Renaissance wasn't the product of a few extraordinary individuals. It was the result of deliberate choices made by thousands of people who decided to invest in education, art, and intellectual inquiry. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live through a period of rapid cultural and technological change, where new possibilities seem to emerge every year, and where traditional limitations were being challenged and overcome? The Renaissance was exactly that kind of period, and it created opportunities for human achievement that hadn't existed since classical antiquity. But here's what's really remarkable. The intellectual and cultural innovations of the Renaissance were about to enable European societies to embark on the most ambitious expansion in human history. The same mathematical techniques that enabled Renaissance artists to master perspective would allow navigators to sail across oceans. The same printing technology that spread Renaissance ideas would make it possible to coordinate global commercial networks. The same spirit of inquiry that drove Renaissance science would motivate European explorers to seek new worlds beyond the known horizon. The stage was being set for 1492, the year that Christopher Columbus would sail west into the Atlantic and accidentally discover continents that Europeans had never imagined existed. The medieval world was about to become a global world, and everything that had been built over the previous 1,000 years was about to be tested on a scale that no previous civilization had ever attempted. October 12th, 1492. 3 small ships from a tiny Spanish port called Palos made landfall on an island in what we now call the Bahamas. The man leading this expedition, Christopher Columbus, thought he had reached the East Indies and spent the rest of his life insisting that he had found a new route to Asia. But what Columbus had actually done was far more momentous. He had connected 2 hemispheres that had been isolated from each other for over 15,000 years, and in doing so he had ended the medieval world forever. This is the story of how 1,000 years of European development, from the fall of Rome to the rise of Renaissance city-states, suddenly exploded outward to reshape the entire globe, creating the first truly worldwide civilization and marking the definitive end of the Middle Ages. But here's what's going to surprise you about 1492. Columbus's voyage wasn't really about discovering America. It was about solving a medieval European problem that had been building for centuries: how to break the Muslim control of trade routes to Asia and create direct access to the spices, silk, and luxury goods that had become essential to European economic life. According to the historian Felipe Fernandez Armesto in Columbus's original plan was breathtakingly simple and completely wrong. Based on his reading of ancient geographers like Ptolemy and medieval travelers like Marco Polo, Columbus calculated that the distance from Europe to Asia by sailing west was about 3,000 miles. The actual distance is about 12,000 miles, but Columbus had no way of knowing that 2 entire continents lay between Europe and Asia. What made Columbus's miscalculation possible was a perfect storm of medieval European technological and intellectual development. According to the maritime historian J.H. Parry in The Age of Reconnaissance, by 1492, European shipbuilders had developed vessels that could survive ocean voyages. European navigators had learned to use celestial navigation and magnetic compasses, and European cartographers had created maps accurate enough to enable systematic exploration. But more importantly, European societies had developed the institutional capacity to organize, finance, and sustain expeditions that required coordination across thousands of miles and multiple years. The same banking systems that had financed medieval cathedral construction could now fund transoceanic voyages. The same legal frameworks that had governed medieval trade could now regulate global commerce. Take Columbus's financing, for example. According to surviving documents analysed by the historian William Phillips, in Christopher Columbus and the Quest for a Route to Asia, Columbus's expedition was funded through a complex partnership involving the Spanish crown, Italian bankers, and Jewish merchants who had been expelled from Spain earlier in 1492. This financial package wouldn't have been possible without the sophisticated commercial networks that medieval Europe had spent centuries developing. Similarly, Columbus's ships represented the culmination of medieval European shipbuilding technology. According to the naval historian Richard Unger in The Ship in the Medieval Economy, the caravel, the type of ship Columbus used for his voyage, incorporated innovations in hull design, rigging and navigation that had been developed over centuries of European maritime experience in the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and the Atlantic. But here's what's really remarkable about 1492. It wasn't just Columbus who was pushing the boundaries of the known world. According to the historian Patricia Seed in Ceremonies of Possession, 1492 also saw Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama preparing for his voyage around Africa to India, which would be completed in 1498 and create the first direct sea route between Europe and Asia. These weren't coincidental developments. They were the culmination of what the historian Geoffrey Scammell calls the medieval maritime revolution. For over 2 centuries, European kingdoms had been systematically developing the technology, knowledge, and institutional capacity needed for global exploration and commerce. The results of Columbus's landing were immediate and catastrophic for the indigenous peoples of the Americas. According to the demographic historian Noble David Cook in Born to Die, European diseases killed an estimated 90% of the Native American population within a century of first contact. This wasn't deliberate genocide. It was the inevitable result of connecting populations that had evolved in isolation from each other for millennia. But the demographic catastrophe in the Americas was matched by a transformation in European society that was equally profound, if less immediately visible. According to the economic historian Dennis Flynn in Global Connections and Monetary History, the influx of American silver fundamentally altered European monetary systems, international trade patterns, and the balance of power between European kingdoms. Spanish ships began returning from the Americas with quantities of silver that dwarfed European mining production. According to calculations by the historian Earl Hamilton in American Treasure and the Price Revolution in Spain, between 1500 and 1650, American mines produced more silver than had been mined in Europe in the entire medieval period. This silver windfall enabled Spain to become the dominant European power for over a century, funding armies that operated across multiple continents and creating the first global empire in human history. But according to the historian Geoffrey Parker in The Grand Strategy of Philip II, Spanish success also created problems that medieval political systems couldn't solve. Managing a global empire required administrative capabilities, communication systems, and financial resources that exceeded anything medieval governments had ever attempted. The Spanish crown had to develop new forms of bureaucracy, new methods of long-distance communication, and new systems of fiscal administration just to maintain control over territories that spanned the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Similarly, the economic opportunities created by American colonization required European societies to develop new forms of commercial organization. According to the business historian Niels Steensgaard in The Asian Trade Revolution, the Dutch East India Company, founded in 1602, was essentially the world's first multinational corporation, with shareholders, professional management, and operations that spanned multiple continents. But perhaps the most profound change triggered by 1492 was intellectual and cultural. The discovery of the Americas forced European thinkers to confront questions that medieval scholarship had never had to consider. How should Christians relate to peoples who had never heard of Christianity? What political and legal rights did indigenous peoples possess? How should European societies organize themselves to govern territories and populations on the other side of the world? According to the intellectual historian Anthony Pagden in The Fall of Natural Man, these questions created the foundation of modern international law, anthropology, and political theory. Spanish scholars like Francisco de Vitoria and Bartolomé de las Casas developed new theories of natural rights, just war, and cultural difference that would eventually contribute to modern concepts of human rights and international justice. Similarly, the practical challenges of governing global empires forced European political theorists to develop new concepts of sovereignty, administration, and law. According to the political scientist Martin van Creveld in The Rise and Decline of the State, the early modern European state system emerged partly in response to the organizational challenges created by global expansion, but 1492 also marked the end of something that had defined European civilization for over 1,000 years. The sense that Christendom was a small, embattled community surrounded by hostile forces. Medieval Europeans had thought of themselves as living in a fortress, protected by castle walls, defended by knightly armies, united by shared faith, but always threatened by Muslims, Vikings, Mongols, or other external enemies. After 1492, Europeans gradually came to see themselves as living in a world that they could explore, exploit, and ultimately dominate. According to the cultural historian Svetlana Todorov in The Conquest of America, this psychological transformation was as important as any technological or political change in explaining European global success over the next 3 centuries. The medieval worldview had emphasized hierarchy, tradition, and acceptance of divinely ordained limitations. The early modern worldview that emerged after 1492 emphasized exploration, innovation, and the possibility of unlimited expansion and improvement. This wasn't just a change in ideas, it was a change in fundamental assumptions about what human beings could accomplish and what goals were worth pursuing. Have you ever experienced a moment when your entire sense of what was possible suddenly expanded? When opportunities that you had never imagined suddenly seemed within reach? That's essentially what happened to European civilization after 1492, except instead of affecting one person's life, it affected an entire continent's understanding of its place in the world. But the transformation triggered by Columbus's voyage also created moral and practical challenges that European societies are still struggling to resolve. The wealth and power that came from global expansion were built on the exploitation and displacement of indigenous peoples, the development of plantation slavery, and the extraction of resources from colonized territories. According to the historian Kenneth Pomeranz in The Great Divergence, European global dominance wasn't inevitable or necessarily the result of superior European institutions or culture. It was partly the result of geographic advantages, partly the result of technological developments that could have occurred elsewhere, and partly the result of historical contingencies that happened to favour European expansion during a crucial period. This means that the rise of the West that began in 1492 wasn't the natural culmination of medieval European development. It was one possible outcome among many that happened to occur because of specific historical circumstances that aligned in ways that favoured European societies over other civilizations. But regardless of how we judge the moral implications of European expansion, there's no question that 1492 marks a fundamental dividing line in human history. Before Columbus, human societies had developed in relative isolation from each other, creating distinct civilizations with different technologies, different political systems, and different ways of understanding the world. After Columbus, human history became global history. Developments in one part of the world increasingly affected developments everywhere else. Technologies, ideas, diseases, crops, and peoples began moving across continents in ways that created the first truly interconnected human civilization. And this brings us to the end of our journey through medieval Europe. Over the course of this series, we've watched a fragmented, impoverished, and seemingly backward region transform itself into the foundation of the modern world. We've seen how the fall of Rome created opportunities for innovation and adaptation. We've seen how barbarian kings learned to govern complex societies. We've seen how medieval institutions developed the organizational capabilities that would eventually enable global expansion. Most importantly, we've seen that the Middle Ages weren't a period of darkness, ignorance, and stagnation. They were a period of experimentation, innovation, and gradual development that created the technological, institutional, and intellectual foundations that made the modern world possible. The medieval Europeans who built cathedrals, developed banking systems, created universities, and established trade networks couldn't have imagined that their achievements would eventually enable their descendants to sail across oceans and establish global empires. But their 1,000 years of patient development, adaptation, and innovation created the civilization that would reshape the entire world after 1492. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, think about this. The medieval world didn't end because it failed. It ended because it succeeded so completely that it grew beyond its original boundaries and became something entirely new. The Middle Ages didn't just prepare Europe for the modern world. They created the modern world, one innovation, one institution, and one impossible dream at a time. And perhaps that's the most important lesson of medieval history, that seemingly small developments, accumulated over generations, can eventually transform entire civilizations in ways that no one could have predicted. The future is being built right now by people who have no idea how their contributions will ultimately reshape the world, just like those medieval cathedral builders, merchant entrepreneurs, and Renaissance scholars who thought they were simply solving immediate problems, but who were actually building the foundation of our modern global civilization. Sweet dreams, and thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through 1,000 years of European history.